Section 1 of Conquistador. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Conquistador by Katharine Fullerton Gerould. 1. Politics, which the planet over, of the fly in the amber, the worm in the bird, the rift in the lute, had, with great suddenness, deprived Wharton Cameron of a job. The little spur line, destined to link Hermosillo with the Santa Rosa mine, would have looked to a low-flying aviator like a fossil slug track, a queer little snaky excoriation of the soil, stared at from the sere and comfortable earth itself, as Wharton Cameron was privileged, in his loneliness, to stare at it. It was more promising, yet more pathetic. To the young engineer's eye, the scarring of the soil, the sketchwork of ties and steel that led up to railhead, not far beyond, the very clutter of pickaxes and shovels and the specks in the middle distance that were happy, abandoned mules, meant something. He knew to the last detail what had been done and what remained to do. To that particular section of the state of Sonora, this hot morning, the railroad meant just nothing, except a thing to get away from as fast as possible, lest Hernando Luca should suspect the next day's payroll of being already on the spot. The personnel of the Ferrocarril de Hermosillo y Santa Rosa, bonds already issued, had decamped to its villages with unseemly and unnatural speed. Hernando Luca had arrived in the vicinity, flashing through the defiles of the Sierra from western Chihuahua, and no one wished to be within scope of his raidings. They did not, even on suspicion of their wages lying in some snug corner of Señor Camarone's corrugated iron office, wish to be paid before they went. They passionately desired, indeed, not only the appearance, but the reality of indigence. Hernando Luca was well known. As for the central government, it was less central than centripetal. El Presidente, far off in Mexico City, withdrew further and further monthly from Sonora and all its ways and works. Without going to the psychology of the mixed breeds that had participated in the building of the Ferrocarril de Hermosillo y Santa Rosa, railhead being, at this time, 15 good miles from Hermosillo, we may say that no man has ever been more solitary, physically and spiritually, than Wharton Cameron. Gazing at his deserted and senseless railway, it had not occurred even to Pedro Gonzalez, his right-hand man and a mestizo, who fancied himself above a bit, to probe the obvious imbecility of his young gringo chief's remaining on the spot. Pedro saddled the best mule he could find, and did not burden himself with any of the plans and documents that yesterday had been the pride of his soul. Even Wharton Cameron knew, as he lingered, that this was one of the occasions when it is fatal for man to be alone. Americans were Luca's favourite meat, and, at present, extremely scarce in Mexico. Cameron's taking over the spur line had been a sporting proposition. No one had guaranteed him proper assistance or an easy time. The plans were all right. It had started out under the best professional auspices, then things had happened, politics. Wharton Cameron had been faced with the necessity of deciding whether he would withdraw like his richer and more experienced compatriots, or stick on and put it through with mestizo help. Trained, of course, but mestizo. As had been amply proved in the recent exodus, he lingered that morning, not because he was a fool, but because he did not know what to do. And when you do not know what to do, you grow sentimental over what might have been. The railway, stretching there, unfinished, impotent, before him, might have been a man's job, the sort of thing that makes rich furnishing for memory. Now it was nothing, unless forsaken picks and shovels could be used to break heads with. They were low, at the moment, thank heaven, on dynamite. At last, with a sigh, he sauntered over to his ignoble headquarters, hoping that if Pedro had burdened himself at all, it had been with money rather than with cartridges. To his amused relief, he found that Pedro must have ridden light. Some of the payroll was gone, but small cash is heavy, and the bulk of it, in both senses, was there. Pedro had helped himself more generously to ammunition, though plenty was left. Still in uncertainty, Cameron stared out of the unglazed window to the south. In 3 minutes he turned quickly, shocked out of lethargy into free action. Those thin spirals of smoke on the horizon, of VIII way, meant only one thing. He was suddenly very glad to be alone. Having no one to help meant also having no one to consult. He stowed away, mechanically, a little money in his belt, but considering cartridges and food a better ballast even than gold for one in his position, he spent most of his attention on them. Taking the saddlebags outside, he fetched his horse, saddled and packed him for departure, then tethered him in the lee of the hut. Returning to the window, Cameron marked, again, the dim spirals on the horizon. It was high time for him to be off in another direction, but he, being what he was, had to do something to show his contempt for everything south of the Rio Grande, as well as his contempt for himself for being on the wrong side of that historic stream. His gesture was, characteristically, to grab a shovel and tunnel under one of the mounds of sand by the track. He worked quickly and sweated freely. In a quarter of an hour the money bags lay beneath the mound, and no one could have guessed which of those processional piles of sand concealed them. Indeed, no one could have guessed anything. If Pedro told, Pedro himself would have to hunt. There was no sign of digging. Cameron went back, then, and mounted his horse. "What I need most now is an alibi," he murmured to himself, and in pursuance of that advice headed his mount northeast, past Railhead, towards the network of canyons that the engineers of the Ferrocarril de Hermosillo y Santa Rosa had spent careful months in planning to avoid. He could not tell what awaited him there, but it was a case where you steer as clear as possible of anything and everything human. By his pistol and cartridges, he had taken nothing from camp except the food in the saddlebags, which might at any moment have to be abandoned, together with his horse. Apart from the pistol and the cash and the cartridges in his belt, he had nothing on his person except clothes, wrist-watch, knife, compass, pipe, and certain papers which, being homeless, he always carried with him. He was also provided with an excellent memory. Thus equipped, Wharton Cameron headed into the hills. If Wharton Cameron had been able to reach Texas, it is more than probable that he would have done so. Defeat being quite out of the question, however, he permitted his mind to dally with other possibilities. If he pushed ever northeastward, it was not simply to get away from the abominable climate of Hermosillo and its environs, not even to remove himself from Hernando Luca's stamping ground. It was because, over there, where Sonora melts into northern Chihuahua, he had a conceivable objective. Not only his compass, but the papers in their worn leather case, which lay in his inner breast pocket, pointed the way. He did not stay long in the hills, though he sheered off from the larger towns. In the first village, he changed into Mexican clothes, of the sort worn by the mestizo ranchero, packing his khaki outfit into the saddlebags. The high-peaked hat and the serape, together with his fluent Mexican Spanish, would make it possible for him to go anywhere, even to the hacienda, whither he was somewhat circuitously tending. The clothes had been his one worry, and they were easily acquired. At dusk, with words coming easily, pistol showing, and quality and fit no earthly consideration to the purchaser, Wharton Cameron reasoned with himself as follows. Could he have chosen, he would have chosen, without doubt, what he called the right side of the Rio Grande, but, situated as he was, there seemed no human chance of his getting through. His own country was not, at the moment, in a position to protect its nationals in a neighbouring state. That, he had known when he elected to go with the Ferrocarril de Hermosillo y Santa Rosa. Every one had warned him to stand from under. Because he was young and foolish, and it was his first railway, he had invited his superiors to wash their hands of him with a clear conscience. They had done so. It was now inevitable that he should live for a time, or die, in Mexico. He had no desire for a brush with Villa's scouts. His situation, he was inclined to believe, was, or presently would be, desperate. He was a gentleman at large, but if he perished, it would, at least, be in the course of satisfying an old, but troublous, curiosity. Since he couldn't get back to the States, he would, by hook or crook, get through to the hacienda of Santa Eulalia. Indeed, it was his only alternative. Cameron put it to himself in that way, to save his Anglo-Saxon face, yet he knew perfectly that, except for Santa Eulalia, he would not have come to Hermosillo and its Ferrocarril at all, except for Santa Eulalia. He would have headed recently, Luca or no Luca, not for the Sierra, but for Guaymas and a coasting schooner. Except for that unknown, unseen hacienda, he would not be wearing sombrero and serape at this moment. he would have faced every devil in Mexico in his khaki shirt and breeches and his battered yet impeccable Stetson. Why had he, since he was orphaned at 18, carried those papers on his person, never separating himself from them for a day? Santa Eulalia, nothing else. He looked like a Creole, as he had always known, and Spanish had accompanied all his youth. It had been of little use to him at Harvard except for freer swearing, as his Creole looks had been of no use except in amateur theatricals, but they had been of use to him on the Ferro Carril, and in nearing Santa Eulalia they would be of use 100-fold. He patted the thin wallet beneath his coat, those papers, his destiny. Turned out neck and crop, perhaps, but he had always meant to see the hacienda, once. Big cattle ranges, he had heard. Well, he knew cattle, all that stuff, Shakespeare and mathematics and choosing a career, and his good friends and classmates, and the yard, and Wharton Cameron, nice boy, and learning to be an engineer, had come later. The yard in spring, and Dory Main with a chaperon. The quick visual memory puckered his face for an instant, almost, not quite, with humour. He flung his serape deftly about his shoulders and face, and muttered a cynicism in Spanish. He would come to grips with that hacienda. The papers were in his pocket. Wharton Cameron, an obvious Creole in cheap, vaquero clothes, set his jaw as the Camerons have always set their jaws. Santa Eulalia. He would reach it, and behold with his own eyes. He carried his letter of introduction with him, if not in his face, in the thin wallet. If, in spite of all, he were not welcomed. "Oh, hell, I'm an American," said Wharton Cameron, and rode on. Caballero every inch. End of section 1, read by Inkel.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
Section 2 of Conquistador. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Conquistador by Katharine Fullerton Gerould. 2. To understand, perhaps to like, Don Fernando Gutierrez, you would have to begin with Cortez. There is no time here and now for such far-flung reminiscence, even for biography of Don Fernando. Moreover, he was, while intensely typical, intensely rare, and to explain him would mean a discourse on Mexican conditions that should both provide a frame for him and make him stand out sharply therefrom. The vast and noble hacienda of Santa Eulalia was his by prime inheritance. He was, himself, pure Creole. The persistence of Santa Eulalia, though shrunk by many thousands of acres, as an entity created by and for the Gutierrez family in the time of the viceroys, was due, no doubt, to the purity of the Spanish strain. There were plenty of mestizo Gutierrez within the domain, but the hacendado had always been of unmixed blood. Diaz had cherished Don Fernando, but, needless to say, he was now unpopular. Yet though Santa Eulalia had known pillage and attack, the heart of the hacienda had always been saved to that inflexible family. If Don Fernando paid secret tribute to the particular general who infested the state of Chihuahua most inveterately, that was no one's affair but his own. The Indians, a very different breed from the Yaquis, were faithful, and the head of the house kept things in his own hands. The ranch was fortified after a fashion, and he could muster a small army for defense. Cattle stealing must be expected, but the house of Gutierrez, built by Don Fernando's grandfather, had withstood, so far, all the evil desires of patriots. The Santa Eulalia peons were more completely subjugated than most, and revolutionary armies knew them not. Any half or quarter Gutierrez with political aspirations had always been properly subsidized and invited to exercise his gifts elsewhere. The government of the hacienda was archaic, even for Mexico. supple and progressive practically, but founded on the bedrock of peonage as best evolved by the Spanish and best adapted to the Indian temperament. So much for Don Fernando Gutierrez, a widower of long standing, unprovided with legitimate issue, perplexed and hesitant as among his bastards. Sensible of having done well by Santa Eulalia in the golden days of Porfirio Diaz, and more contemptuous now than fearful of patriots, he was conscious, most of all, during these lean and troubled years, that Santa Eulalia was entering upon its twilight, since he himself was its declining sun. After him, at best, the evening star, Juan, or another. The whole hacienda was feeling the influence of nightfall. As the sun set crimson, drowsiness departed from the vast patio. Upspringing chatter, scurrying activities, tinkle of guitars, and clashing of pots spoke of relaxation and refreshment. Don Fernando prepared for the evening meal. As he stalked through the patio on his way to the patriarchal board, idlers turned to watch the master. A bold infant caromed against his leg in greeting and was well slapped by a laughing mother, proudly conscious that the baby was, in truth, Don Fernando's grandson. Sons and daughters were all well grown by this time, for the hacendado had not prolonged his promiscuities beyond late middle age. His paramours had all taken their places in the scheme of things, and at the heart of all that clamor and business he was a lonely man. The banquet board fed 50, the scraps thereof 100. There was excellent wine, ceremoniously poured for Don Fernando. Below the salt, they swam in mezcal. Don Fernando sat at the head of the table, a lonely man, as we have said, above the salt. There was no senora to share rulership of the feast. The women who had been his were dead, or scattered about the big hacienda. In towns, things are different, but a hacendado, isolated by the very extent of his possessions, cannot well have two establishments. In his own domain he may take what he pleases, but ladies of the opera do not come his way. Don Fernando, unlike many, had never been the town-haunting aristocrat. As for his remarrying, Santa Eulalia, a country in itself, enclosed him from his kind, and he had greatly loved the childless wife of his youth. Dusk deepened, and lamps were lighted. Don Fernando dreamed over his coffee and cognac, while the lesser folk, having fed, scattered. A few Indian girls stood by to fill his cup or fetch tobacco. The routine was so familiar to him that he almost sank, hypnotized, into sleep where he sat, though presently he would rouse and address himself to accounts at a huge desk of mahogany, trimmed with tarnished brass. There was a stir, a sudden pulse of sound, in the diminishing clatter of the courtyard, and Vicente, the major-domo, entered the room. With him came Wharton Cameron, his face and figure giving the lie to his half-breed clothes. Vicente faded away without explanations. Indeed, he had none to give. Don Fernando rose. The two men faced each other. The quick Spanish wove a pattern between them. Then Cameron ate and drank, quickly, for his host was in obvious haste to be rid of servitors. Within an hour from the time when Cameron had crossed the patio, he stood in the hacendado's office, beside the vast mahogany desk, and took the thin wallet out of his inner pocket. He laid the papers on the desk, under the lamp, enumerating them as he did so. My mother's birth certificate, her marriage lines, my birth certificate, my father's will, her photograph, a letter from old Inez to you, which I have never before had the opportunity to deliver. He folded his arms and looked down at his wares. What do you want of me, senor? The Mexican accent was there, but the ring of it was pure Castilian. Wharton Cameron smiled, austerely, as befitted his features. Shelter, for a day or two, if you are not too prejudiced against an American citizen, especially at the moment, a place to sleep. Tomorrow, or next day, if you would permit, a good view of Santa Eulalia, to fix it in the memory. As evidence of good faith, here Wharton Cameron achieved an American grin, here is my pistol. Also, With a quick, rippling movement he stripped off his belt. "My cartridges." He lifted his arms as if Don Fernando had uttered the familiar "hands up." "Defenseless," he murmured, still in Spanish. Don Fernando, ignoring the papers, stared at Cameron intently. "You are very sure of something," he said. "Of you, senor," the young man replied quietly. "I have heard a great deal about you all my life." To neither, apparently, did it occur to sit down and discuss the matter then. "I will take you to your room," Don Fernando said. "You must, by your own account, need rest. I will keep these things overnight." His hand indicated all the objects that lay on the desk. Wharton Cameron nodded. "The pistol and the cartridges, yes. The papers, no, senor." Don Fernando's eyes glinted. "You said that you had heard much talk about me." "True, but since I was 18 years old, those papers have never left my person for a day or a night. If I relinquish the papers, I relinquish also the hospitality of Santa Eulalia." "Come." The older man strode out of the room ahead of him and called to Vicente. Cameron pocketed his wallet, leaving his weapon on the desk. Don Fernando did not even turn his head to see. Across the patio, diagonally, rose a huge masonry tower, roughly adapted to defense. There were musket holes in the staircase that wound up within it. Hither Don Fernando and the steward preceded Cameron. High up at the top of the staircase, a heavy door gave access to a large chamber, stone-walled, stone-floored. There was musty furniture, a giant bed with dark hangings, a clothes press, a chair or two, a carved prie-dieu, small, unglazed windows, deeply embrasured and heavily barred to boot, let in the night air. An Indian girl in a blue rebozo pattered in with candles, then pattered out again. "Good night," said Don Fernando formally. "I commend you to Our Lady of Guadalupe." He pointed within the bed hangings to an image above the headboard. When he had left the chamber, Cameron heard, with grim amusement, a bolt shot on the other side of the door. "Santa Eulalia," he whispered to himself. "Santa Eulalia at last. Rather a jolly old boy, too, Don Fernando. They always said so." He paced the room as he went through his makeshift preparations for the night. He went on talking to himself for several minutes, in good American, but as he blew out the candles and started to climb into the great high-pillared bed, another mood, past his comprehension, took him. He knelt down, with his face turned towards Our Lady of Guadalupe, and murmured a prayer in Spanish. Overlaid with so much, who could have guessed it would come suddenly and imperiously back to his lips? But so it was. Then he slept deeply, without dreams. The next days were more like a minuet than a week of life. Something in Wharton Cameron was able to recognize the music and improvise the steps. Alone at night in his stone chamber, never locked on the outside again, he reverted, in soliloquy, to his father's language and the humor of his period. He remembered ironically how hard he tried, in the long daylight hours, not to stumble in the archaic dance, to show, by every considered phrase and all the detail of punctilio, that the Spanish half of him was pure. He was a brave figure now, in clothes furnished him by Don Fernando. His khaki clothing, miraculously cleaned and pressed, hung in the great wardrobe forgotten. The clothes helped him to play the game. Youth helped him, too, for it was impossible not to be impressed by Don Fernando, that great gentleman of a bygone day, provincial and unacquainted with capitals, but moving feudally in a feudal world without a misstep. The elder man's reticence on main issues was complete. Their conversations lay in Wharton's memory like strange scraps of embroidery, unpieced, unpieceable. Perhaps Don Fernando was watching, but for what? Cameron did not know. Impossible to tell. Meanwhile, the great domain of Santa Eulalia worked its way into Cameron's inmost soul. One day, riding far afield, he permitted himself enthusiastic comments. "You know cattle?" Don Fernando asked. "I was brought up in cattle country." "Your father was a ranchero?" He did not say hacendado, and the fact bit Cameron. But he answered quietly. His health forced him to renounce his profession. He went west and bought a ranch, to be in the open air. Tuberculous? Cameron, for some unknown reason, went red all over. No, senor, a nervous breakdown. And he took the liberty of changing the subject. Who is the lad who rides always with us? He had learned to identify those features, but had never made out the young man's occupation. Don Fernando's face grew somber. Juan, your enemy. And he, not Cameron, changed the subject. Your father was of good birth? This time Cameron felt no insult. Excellent. The younger son of a younger son, but good stock. You will admit that he did not contract an unworthy marriage. Don Fernando, however, admitted nothing. He had inspected the papers carefully and given them back without comment. Cameron, dominated more than he quite cared to admit by the older man, had offered to leave his mother's picture with him for a time, but it was handed back to him with a courtly bow. She married without her parents' consent, senor. There was no condemnation in her elder brother's tone, only cold repetition of a law. Not once in speech to Cameron did Don Fernando confess to considering himself his uncle. Another day. You have no name but that strange one which I cannot pronounce. Only another English one, Paul. My father named me from his own relatives. My mother, appreciating his pride of family, made no attempt to christen me from her side. As you so truly said, Don Fernando, she married without her parents' consent. She was the soul of delicacy. Paul, Pablo. Don Fernando spoke the names quietly. Then he spurred his horse and they rode into a huge corral. Again, a few days later, in the shade of the patio. Why is Juan my enemy? His mother was castiza, not like the rest. Less Indian blood there. No other reply was forthcoming. It seemed that Don Fernando held it sufficient. So, for a week, Wharton Cameron found himself playing the part of an uninvited, but not unwelcome guest. If, as he became accustomed to the hacienda, he moved among its inhabitants with the half-insolent grace of an acknowledged master, it was not because he expected Don Fernando to claim kinship. It was because he felt, for the first time in his life, all the subtle significances of being white. In that whiteness he did not even count the Cameron strain. He called himself, in his own mind, a Creole. His carved mirror gave him corroboration daily. Santa Eulalia was indeed working upon him. If the hacienda were molding itself another lord, he did not know it. The talk of the patio and the outlying villages Cameron did not hear. At the end of 10 days, Cameron thanked Don Fernando for his hospitality, expressed with emotion his admiration for Santa Eulalia, and asked, with frank deference, the older man's advice as to his next move. They sat by the lamplight in the hacendado's place of business. That rascal Villa is very busy still between here and the Rio Grande, said Don Fernando. But there are ways. One detail irks me, Don Pablo. He drew silently at his cigar for a moment, sitting motionless, his silver buttons winking in the light. Cameron waited. The payroll, said the Spaniard, after a time. You buried it, I understand. What is the probability of some of that scum's having found it? Very slight, I think. They were damnably afraid of Luca. But Luca has been in Durango for more than 3 weeks. My information is, I think, reliable. With time enough to hunt, they might well find it. But who would disturb the sand? The railway, you can be sure, is quite abandoned. They might consider that you had removed it. Cameron laughed in the shadows. They might, but since I did not. I should not like to have it said of my guest, Don Pablo. Cameron rose and stood very straight before his host. A guest is easily disowned in these times, but if you have any question, Don Fernando, I shall be glad to remove beforehand any stigma that might rest on Santa Eulalia. Don Fernando smiled. To whom, properly, should the money be returned? The mayor of Hermosillo is a director of the company. He would be a proper person to receive it. I cannot say that I think, if he ever received it, that he would ever pay it out again. That does not concern me. Don Fernando waved away the mayor's private character. Your suggestion? Cameron was breathing hard. He seemed just then to be wholly knit to the elder man, with bonds unbreakable and personal. He did not resent the tone of authority which crept for the first time into Don Fernando's speech to him. It can be done, the hacendado murmured. All things can be done, if you know the way and the country. You will go to Hermosillo, Don Pablo, and privately inform the mayor of the whereabouts of the payroll. You will accompany him on his search. And if someone else has found it first? You will inform the mayor privately, as I said. He will be quite willing to go with you, the more anxious to go quietly if, as you think, he would prefer to keep the money for himself. If the money is still there, he can return and fetch it at his leisure. If it is not, you and Juan can protect yourself from his disappointment. You will, of course, arrange that. As there are only two of you, there shall be only two of them. Then you will return to Santa Eulalia. Why is Juan to go with me? Don Fernando's eyes did not meet his, but brooded on the distance. Juan is the one who can best guide you. Juan is clever, and is known where it would be advantageous to you to be known, to the Yaquis and the little rancheros in eastern Sonora. I should doubt your getting to Hermosillo safely alone. I got here safely alone. By a slow and difficult route. With Juan it will be easy. In Hermosillo you will yourself be known. When do I start? There was a faint flicker of humor in Cameron's tone, but underneath the American jauntiness was solid submission to the head of the house. He had never thought of Wharton Cameron, Sr., in those archaic terms, but so he thought of Don Fernando. Santa Eulalia had not been idle. He wanted, honestly, nothing from Don Fernando but verbal acknowledgment of what his papers attested, but to get that he would prove himself in any way demanded. Then he could say farewell. Tomorrow, Vicente shall bring you other clothes. Why not these? You must look like Juan's dependant. It is Juan who is to be fine on this occasion. Cameron flushed. I am not quite sure, Don Fernando, that I like this. I can go alone, as I came, in my own clothes. The hacendado shook his head. Risky, slow. I am impatient. It struck Cameron that he was about as impatient as bronze. I am anxious for the return, when debts will have been paid. The young man tossed his head. Juan's servant? No. Give me back my khaki. He spoke as if it were not hanging in his own room, ready to his hand. I appreciate, but it is best. I know the dangers better than you. You go, Don Pablo, for the honor of Santa Eulalia. Permit me to know, at every point, what is due to that honor. He stepped forward and laid his hands on Cameron's shoulders. Black eyes looked deep into black eyes. It is only the clothes, Don Pablo, for your safety. In more senses than one. You and Juan will have horses perfectly matched. You would prefer, probably, your own pistol. You shall have it. Juan will carry, inevitably, his machete. His eyes clouded for an instant. A machete would be of no use to you, for you would not know how to handle it. Remember one thing, Don Pablo. A man in your position, if threatened with a machete, has a right to use his pistol. If any one you meet upon your travels draws his hand so, into the folds of his serape, then shoot. Unless Juan is free to deal with him, machete to machete. But if you must look to yourself, shoot at once. The land is full of outlaws. Never turn your back to any one. He dropped his hands. I have been in wild country before, Don Fernando. The older man sighed. Never so wild as this, Don Pablo. Will you leave the papers with me? Cameron shook his head. I regret, senor, but as they have never left me, so they never shall. Don Fernando lighted a cigarette. "Suppose, for the sake of argument, that you were killed on the way to Hermosillo." "They could not profit you, senor, or for that matter the man who killed me. Their virtue dies with me. But," he took out the wallet and extracted the photograph of his mother, "this I will leave behind, not for you, Don Fernando, since you could hardly desire it, but with your permission I will leave it in the room where her son has slept these last nights. I cannot risk my mother's portrait being ground into the dust or dabbled over with blood. The other papers go with me." "As you say, Don Pablo, the portrait shall be cared for." "Does Juan know of your plan yet?" "Not yet. I will send for him presently when you retire. Vicente is arranging all that is necessary. You will find your clothes ready to put on in the morning. The start must be early. I shall look for you and Juan back in 10 days at most. Do not keep me waiting." Cameron stood at dawn, just outside the cool dark tunnel of the entrance arch. An Indian held his and Juan's horses, both cleverly packed and saddled by Vicente's own hands. Dressed like a vaquero of the meaner sort, Cameron gave the lie to his own equipment. Chin and mouth were covered in that chill air by his cheap serape, but the Creole eyes burned visibly. Don Fernando and Juan emerged through the archway, Don Fernando stern, Juan sulky. As the two young men stood ready to mount, Don Fernando lifted his hand. "I commend you to God, my children." Cameron suddenly threw back his head and laughed. "When shall we three meet again?" he quoted in English. And when Don Fernando questioned him with a shade of irritation, he translated with laughter. The hacendado rebuked him. "It is not well to ask that question, even in jest, for always the answer of heaven may be never. I commend you equally to God." The young men mounted, and the two faces were turned from him, Juan's sulky still, and Cameron's still lit with laughter. End of section 2.
Section 3 of Conquistador. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Conquistador by Katharine Fullerton Gerould. 3. 11 days later, Don Fernando kept close to the ranch house all day, sitting in his office that commanded the approach. Not even a word from a distant corral of stampeding cattle took him afield. His meals were served to him apart. As afternoon drew on, he summoned Vicente more than once. 10 days were an ample allowance. The return would be child's play, he muttered at one moment. "Fetch the Señora's chair, Vicente, and set it beside mine at the head of the board. I shall not dine alone." Vicente's jaw dropped. "Who will sit in that chair, Señor?" he whispered. "My heir, the next Gutierrez. He cannot delay beyond tonight." 10 days were enough. It is now 11, 12, and I should burst. 2 went forth, Vicente speculated to himself in a distant corner. The young Americano who looks like a Spaniard, and our Juan. One of these he will make his heir. Vicente had never seen Cameron's papers, but be sure he knew. The old majordomo could not be deceived in family matters. Moreover, there was the photograph of Doña Mercedes. "What are you growling about, Vicente?" The grey-haired steward came and stood beside his master's chair. "I say 2 went forth, and 2 will return. Is it after a perilous journey that either should be affronted by an honour paid to the other? Either the guest, Don Pablo, or Juan, the child of the hacienda? If 2 return, I am the last Gutierrez, and the Señora's empty chair shall mark that fact. But 2 will not return, Vicente. To God I commended them both, equally. The ordeal I arranged myself, as honourably as might be. I could not deprive Juan of his machete, but I told Don Pablo to shoot without hesitation." Vicente, who had now grasped the situation, permitted himself one murmur. He was, after all, the hacendado's foster brother. And our Juan should sit at the Señora's chair before the notary has made him legitimate? Don Fernando shivered a little. "When these things are arranged comfortably with the requirements of honour, Vicente, the decision is heaven's. If Juan returns, I shall not keep him waiting until Don Luis has mended his pen, but it may be the other." Vicente shook his head. Juan had his machete. A round oath was his reward. Could I help it that they do not teach the use of the machete in the United States? Of what do you accuse me? I told the other to shoot when he saw the arm stir under the serape like this. And if they both return? Vicente held to his hypothesis. They could not, for one will certainly try to kill Pablo. The whole hacienda knows by this time that Don Pablo is my sister's child. Look you, Vicente, it was a hard decision. Therefore I left it to heaven. Neither one is pure Spanish. Only heaven can decide which of the two other bloods is better. And the one who kills proves his blood the better. Vicente did not question it, he merely affirmed. It is Juan who will try first to kill, said Don Fernando calmly, because he knows more. But I tell you heaven decides these things when all has been well prepared. The survivor will be the better man. Caramba! The sun is sinking. Will this never be over? Vicente withdrew to fetch the heavy chair, twin of Don Fernando's own, but uneasy, thrilled, half unhappy. He returned to his master when his task was done. Together they stood by the barred window that looked towards the gate. Half an hour, and the two faces, not unlike in the twilight of the room, were bloodless and drawn with expectation. A cloud of dust by the far gate. A muffled figure, rocking slightly on the horse, coming nearer. "My son! My son!" cried Don Fernando, and strode to the door. No man could have told who was enfolded in the serape, nor did Don Fernando know. Whichever it was now his son. "Remove the Señora's chair," he hissed to Vicente as he distanced him, for the man who had returned was sore hurt, or he would not rock so in the saddle. A moment later, a huddled form slipped off at Don Fernando's feet, and only when his firm hands had unwound the serape did he know, when he had untwisted the last fold. He looked past dried and clotted bloodstains into Wharton Cameron's face. End of section 3, read by Inkel.
Section 4 of Conquistador. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Conquistador by Katharine Fullerton Gerould. 4. Don Pablo Gutierrez swung out of the saddle and drew a long, hot sigh. He had been far afield all day among shifting herds and wild young vaqueros. He had ridden himself to weariness, and his clothes seemed stuck to him. But before he went to bathe and change, he stopped at Don Fernando's door. "How goes it, Vicente?" The old man sighed. "He has had Don Miguel with him for an hour. I think that means the end." Don Pablo's brow clouded. Don Fernando wasted, ordinarily, little of his chaplain's time. "Shall I dine as usual, or stay with him, Vicente?" "I think he would prefer you to sit in his place first, then come to him." Pablo Gutierrez nodded and walked to his great chamber in the tower, which he had always kept. The end. As he washed and dressed, his grave, dark face grew graver. No one who loved Don Fernando could wish him longer life, but the burden lay heavy on his adopted son. His role these last 2 years had not been hard, for Wharton Cameron had loved his uncle at sight, and week by week had come to love him more. He had let himself go Spanish, sinking the other strain out of sight. Easier, too, than he had expected, for Santa Eulalia had been a magical sound in his ears ever since he could remember. All he had known in youth of piety, all he had known of romance, had flowed into his mind from the tales of the hacienda, the saga of the Gutierrez, the legend of the first conquistador. Woman, talk from his mother and old Inez, but held how close, how deep in his heart. It had all begun when he was a child in stature, and the sight of the hacienda and Don Fernando had reiterated an unchallengeable claim. Something that first night had stepped out of the Mexican shadows to lay a hand on him, and never had touched, had pressure seemed so familiar. Don Fernando had encountered, probably to his own surprise, no difficulty with his heir. Wharton Cameron stripped himself of his name and his citizenship as easily as he abandoned his khaki. All that, in truth, had been done before. At the moment when he turned suddenly to meet Juan's machete, and had shot Juan dead, even as he himself reeled under the impact of that hate-driven knife. He saw only the finish of the peculiar gesture, for Juan had meant to plant the machete in his back, between the shoulder blades, against which he had been warned by Don Fernando. But, "Then shoot," rang in his ears, and he shot before the knife sank in. In that terrific moment, he knew all that Don Fernando, waiting in anguish, had revealed to old Vicente, understood the ordeal which had been prepared, saw himself submitting. He had killed Juan and straightway returned home. Never for one instant had he regretted killing Juan. He had no shudders over that corpse. But, by killing him, he had accepted Santa Eulalia forever. The Cameron in him did not whimper, it withdrew, as if his Cameron blood literally turned back from the heart to hoard itself in a private vein until its time should come. He was all Gutierrez. He stirred to the old man beside him as though he had been, in truth, his son. Not a voice in all the hacienda, since Juan's was stilled, so much as whispered him Americano, though women's lips whispered him a monk. He thought and dreamed these days in Spanish, and if you had asked Wharton Cameron if he was a gentleman, Pablo Gutierrez would have told you that he was a caballero. Don Pablo donned white clothes for the evening meal, like any young Mexican dandy. Don Fernando, who never wore European garb, encouraged his heir to be more modern. All day Pablo wore the clothes of the vaquero, of softest leather and most richly embroidered. But at night he did as any young Gutierrez might have done, aping the ways of the foreigner. The clothes were made by a tailor in Chihuahua, and Pablo saw nothing odd in their cut. Nor did he feel it strange now to have a knife in his belt at all times. The wide sash at present concealed all but the top of the hilt. Pablo Gutierrez took his uncle's place, and ate and drank, with a brooding eye on his dependents. Not a man, woman, or child there who did not know that he had killed Juan, but it is to be feared that they took it as an added recommendation of Don Pablo. Juan's mother had died long since. No one else, it was safe to say, had ever loved Juan. Had Juan gotten his knife work 3 seconds earlier, Don Fernando might have learned to love him at heaven's bidding. But an ordeal is final, and the hacendado had never mentioned Juan since Wharton Cameron made his first report of the incident. Heaven had sent Don Fernando a son, as authentic to his mind as the clever, sulky brat with whom the little wildcat Benita had long ago endowed him. Pablo Gutierrez stood on firm ground. Tonight, however, was to show Don Pablo another ordeal, more complex even than that earlier one, when 2 had been sent into the wilderness together in order that only one might return. For use and want are strange and potent things, and Pablo Gutierrez, heir to Santa Eulalia, had come to love his adopted father profoundly. Therefore he was, that night, to know grief and loneliness and the pain of giving what he did not wish to give, because he wished to give it. He shouldered his way gently into the room where his uncle lay, and sat down beside the bed. Don Miguel had disappeared. He thought he had seen a cassock slipping past him in the dusky patio. There was a prick of light in the chapel window. "My father," said Pablo, and could say no more. Here, before his eyes, was very great weakness and probably some pain. "My son," came the reply. Then silence, while Don Fernando gathered force for further speech. "I have confessed and received the body of Christ." The young man nodded. "1 or 2 things remain to be said. If I had had 5 years more, nothing would be left to say. Everything would have been settled, but I have been stricken aforetime, and before I give Santa Eulalia into your keeping, as by tomorrow I shall have done, I wish to know a little more explicitly about Santa Eulalia's future. By law, the hacienda is yours in a few hours, but to a caballero there are rights above the law. There is no right you could claim that I should not instantly grant. There is no room for distrust or even caution between us." "No." Don Fernando closed his eyes. Presently he spoke again, quickly and shortly, as if breath came hard. "Your religion and your wife." Don Pablo gently released the other's hand, which he had been holding in his own. He folded his arms. "Let us take the wife first," he said quietly. "Some day you will lie as I am lying. To what manner of man, then, will you be speaking as I am speaking now to you?" "You mean, who will be my son's mother?" "Yes, for you have no mistress, as far as I know, and in any case I would not wish you a life like mine. My wife was childless. It seemed that Juan would have to have Santa Eulalia until God and Hernando Luca sent you to me. I should have had a boy all Spanish, Pablo. I do not regret what I have had, but you know how men are, never so sure of another as of themselves. I do not care to marry. Perhaps heaven will send me a son from afar, as it sent you one." But the dying man was fretfully logical. "No, because you are kinless. You have no sister to bequeath you a son." "True." Pablo Gutierrez brooded for a time over his own deep affairs. He should have known that this would come. He should have thought. But he had left it to the easy future. His mistake. My uncle, what shall I say? To marry a Spanish woman, I must leave the hacienda and twang a guitar beneath the barred window in Chihuahua or Mexico. Cattle are cattle on either side the Rio Grande. A caballero is a caballero still. But women? Then I begin to see that I am not at all Gutierrez. And it troubles me. I who, for both our sakes, wish to be all Gutierrez. Save about women, I believe. Before God, I am. Had you ever loved before you came to me? I called it love. And she? She may be married or dead, Don Fernando. We were boy and girl, American fashion. Do not try to wrench me back. But a man cannot die childless and leave a Santa Eulalia forlorn. Better one of these girls about the place. Only, for the sake of the hacienda, do not marry her. Legitimize your son, rather, before you die. And yet, Pablo, that is not the best way. Had I lived, I would have taken my old bones to Mexico and found you a señorita, one you would have had to love, the Cameron as well as the Gutierrez. The heir of the Gutierrez bent forward and, resting his elbows on his knees, sank his chin in his hands. I am a man like other men, Don Fernando. It is no harder for me than for another to make love to a pretty girl. Or I may yet go to Mexico and be a town blood, offering Santa Eulalia to a bride. But there is that in me which would prefer to take a wife in another fashion. It is very hard. Even though time presses, I cannot make a promise in the dark. If I die childless, Don Fernando, to whom shall Santa Eulalia go? There are distant kin in Spain. You will find the papers. They have already been acquainted with the fact of your adoption. But oh, hijo mío, get me a son, for I have loved you greatly, Pablo. No. He turned his head on the pillow. Make no promise, for I have known love. Pablo Gutierrez, who saw Don Fernando growing weaker each moment, realized the relentlessness of the hour. No time, we say, and reluctantly wait for another occasion. But no time when there is no morrow is another matter. He had, ere this, felt the clinging pressure of Santa Eulalia's arms upon him, had lain his head happily upon her breast. Now he felt her nails in his flesh, sharp as the point of Juan's machete. He flung his head back and spoke in an agony from a constricted throat, harshly though low. I will get a son, unless heaven rewards my efforts only with daughters. But do not press me as to the mother of my children. I can make no undertaking. I have never been able to love any of these girls who are brave at fiestas and make eyes at the young master. Forgive me, Pablo, came the whisper. It is Santa Eulalia, stronger than either of us. Who would rule Santa Eulalia must be Conquistador. I know. Pablo, his own mastery regained, tried to soothe him. And Mother Church, went on Don Fernando, his breath catching and failing. I should have asked you all this before, but I thought there was time, and it would come gently of itself. I am no priest-ridden, superstitious fellow. I think no less of you for not practicing your mother's faith assiduously. Yet unless religion is maintained, the peons run after politics and go distraught with windy modern notions. Without religion, the hacienda would not hold 3 months. So I have held up Don Miguel's hands, and that, to keep the hacienda safe, the hacendado must do. I have no religion in the dogmatic sense, Don Pablo replied quietly. I was baptized into the church. I made my first communion and a few others. Since I came to manhood, I have had nothing to do with it. But you will return? It is only a few gestures, the gestures every Gutierrez has always made. While I was here, it passed that no one ever saw you take the sacrament. For all they knew, you confessed and communicated in private. But they must see their master at Easter at God's table, see him with their own eyes, and follow in his train. Look, Pablo, every caballero believes in God. Every caballero believes in God, Pablo repeated quietly. Well then, the rest is simple. Don Miguel, who has never split hairs with me, will not split hairs with you. A Gutierrez is always a son of the church. When you believe in God, everything else follows. I can have no hesitation in asking you, for Santa Eulalia's sake, to forsake the lax ways of youth, not leave my poor Indians masterless. Pablo Gutierrez was silent. Have you ever had absolution for killing Juan? Came the voice from the shadows. Never. A strange wind from the north rang in Don Pablo's ears, but he clapped a hand over the thin, far voice of the ancient convenanter. That was not well, child. The young man bit his lip. No, it was not well. He laid his hand on his uncle's forehead. All shall be done as you command. I do not command. I but tell you as father to son. I understand. He understood only that he greatly loved Don Fernando and that Santa Eulalia was a coat he must wear. All else blurred in the immediacy of that sense. Then, prompt as a man's shadow, Don Miguel entered the room. An Indian boy, dressed as an acolyte, accompanied him. None too soon, for an hour later Don Fernando lay unconscious. End of section 4.
Section 5 of Conquistador. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Conquistador by Katharine Fullerton Gerould. 5. Part 1. A caballero is a caballero still. Cattle are cattle on either side of the Rio Grande. If you believe in God, everything else follows. No mirror gave back Wharton Cameron to himself. The very tongue in his head betrayed him easily to Spain. Santa Eulalia was a coat he must wear. Yet no man's destiny is made completely easy for him. The clash of codes is the heart of all drama, and Wharton Cameron, though he had proved himself supple, was not to give the game without protest to Pablo Gutierrez. On the point of sex, the caballero was still to find himself face to face with the gentleman. Codes cohabit easily until it comes to women. Then jungle and steppe, delta and forest proceed to argue their differences. Exceeding loneliness was Pablo's portion after Don Fernando died. The hacendado worked himself hard, yet, even so, there were aching spaces that once would have been filled with talk. At the local bullfights, the fiestas, Pablo carried himself gaily, bravely, as a young man should. But the girl still wrote him down a monk, little knowing that he asked of each pair of slow, dark eyes a secret and hopeless question. A man must define romance as he can. Unluckily, the Camerons defined it for Don Pablo, and he had no appeal. Yet his youth ached within him, and sometimes, as he eyed Manuelita or Carmen from under languid lids, his face grew very grim. Everything he had yielded to Santa Eulalia, save this. Was Santa Eulalia to get this from him too? He was no prude, but in this one matter he was the slave of taste. His gorge rose at the notion of taking a woman save in the way his taste dictated, which was not the way of Creole courtship, nor yet the way of a lord among his serfs. He took it out in accentuating his Spanish heritage in other ways. He entered the ring with the bull and won the Espada's prize. He drank mezcal and aguardiente, leaving Don Fernando's cellar in peace. At the evening meal, his silver buttons and gold thread winked in the lamplight, as had Don Fernando's. He became ever more provincial, hoping, by aping Don Fernando's manners, to ape, in the end, his heart. On some dim hypothesis, he even refused to consent to Manuelita's marriage, thereby giving her a wild hope and building a very temple of trouble for himself. Politics, which had deprived Wharton Cameron of a job and given Pablo Gutierrez a vast inheritance, now laid a finger again on the situation. In other words, certain stormy figures had passed. The country had quieted down somewhat, and though Americans were not precisely pampered, it was possible to travel in Mexico again. Trains were not blown up, and regardless of unsigned treaties, people scurried back and forth once more across the Rio Grande. Pablo Gutierrez had not failed to inform a few friends of the fiasco at Hermosillo, his journey to Santa Eulalia, and his remaining with Don Fernando. His killing of Juan he kept to himself. Even to Dick Rivers he could not, perhaps, quite explain the perfect correctness of the ordeal. Rivers had little historic sense, and his ancestors had been East India merchants, not conquistadores. It was to Rivers his thoughts turned. rather than to other friends, partly because Rivers was the most irresponsible of them all. A man with Santa Eulalia on his back could think with tenderness of an easy and flittering soul like Dick's. So far had Pablo retreated to stand beside his mother's kin that when Rivers's letter reached him, and he sat down at the big mahogany desk to issue his invitation, he found his own English stilted and flowery. That would never do for Dick Rivers, and he knitted his brows, fingered his knife hilt, and recaptured some outdated American slang for a postscript. He had thought at first of going down himself to Mexico City and fetching Rivers back with him, but he renounced the notion. What had he to do with Mexico City? He was the isolated, old-fashioned hacendado, still short of 30, remember. Rivers must see him as he was, in his own place. He had not even the clothes to consort with tourists. No, he would send an escort down to Chihuahua, and meet his friend only on the threshold of the hacienda. If Dick Rivers had any help to give, it must be given to Pablo Gutierrez and none other. Counting on Dick's light-heartedness, he did not realize precisely what form that would take, nor could he have reckoned that Pablo Gutierrez, standing before the great archway of the house, clad in softest leather, booted, spurred, embroidered, tight-trousered, impassive of feature and imperious of mien, was not precisely what Dick Rivers was looking for. Dick Rivers, as always, was looking for a lark, even here at the back of Beyond. The escort, the old-fashioned carriage, the dizzying goblets of aguardiente in the fonda before they clattered forth on their way, had all been larky enough to suit even Dick. Now, Pablo Gutierrez, facing him with a carved smile, cooled his rioting head. Rivers thought for a dazed instant that he had flushed the wrong bird. Then Pablo stepped forward. Something boyish in his heart went wildly out to greet his classmate. That Dick Rivers was half tipsy from aguardiente made him no less familiar. Pablo's eyes dazzled. He saw Dick's towhead, and beyond it the yard in spring. No Gutierrez before had ever gripped a friend's hand in just that way. The look, the gesture, the touch reassured Rivers. It was Cameron, in spite of all, though, "Hello, old man, I say," was as far as he got just then. For if beyond Dick's towhead Don Pablo saw the yard in spring, beyond the yard in spring he saw a woman. No, not Dory Mayne, whose head had half begun to shimmer for him in that vernal vision, a woman of very different stamp, who was impatiently waiting to get out of the carriage until some gentleman should assist her. Doña Flora of the Teatro Español was not in the least taken aback by the hacendado. She approved him highly, but she was not going to take that easy step to earth unassisted. Rivers became aware of the situation. He waved his hand. "I knew you were living on Garçon, Cameron, so I brought her along. Don't ask me why. She just came for the ride. Got tired of town, I suppose. It's, purely temporary. I hope she won't be in your way. She's housebroken and all that. She's a perfect lady. You know, an absolute godsend to me, because she speaks French. I didn't have much time to let you know. She just turned up at the train. Here, I'll get her out." But Don Pablo distanced him, and handed Doña Flora down from the carriage. His face was unsmiling bronze as he did so, but the lady made no complaint, even inwardly. Every drop of blood in her veins did obeisance to the hacienda and all it stood for. "I was not prepared for a lady," Pablo said to his friend, "but I will have her put in your room, and have another got ready for you. Vicente," he turned to the aged steward, "take the Senora to Don Ricardo's room and have them prepare another for him, and," his eyes veiled themselves strangely for an instant, "find Manuelita. She might be of use to Doña Flora." He waved the idol of the Teatro Español to Vicente's care. Then he turned to Rivers. "You had better come into my room here until they get a place ready for you. Why the devil didn't you say you wanted to bring a woman with you?" His English was thawing rapidly. "Didn't I tell you I didn't? But you know what women are. She's been a good pal of mine the last few weeks, and I hated to chuck her off the train." Why did she want to come? Oh, she's fond of me, I think, and this expedition rather postpones the final farewell. She's a pretty good scout. Rivers stretched his legs and yawned. I like her a lot, you know. He said suddenly, I suppose you wouldn't call it a grand passion, but it's been pretty fast going. I don't know how she will amuse herself here. There will be no one for her to talk to. What about you and me? I'm off in the saddle half the time. I supposed you would join me. I'm a very busy man with 50,000 acres to look after. Lord, I should think so. River's jaw dropped. Oh, well, we'll worry along. I could send her back, if necessary. Don Pablo shrugged his shoulders. There is really no place for her in the social scheme of Santa Eulalia, my dear fellow. Vicente entered and stood at attention. His master spoke to him in low, rapid Spanish. Did you find Manuelita for the senora? Don Pablo, Manuelita refuses. Has a room been made ready for Don Ricardo? Yes, senor. Pablo Gutierrez turned to his friend. Vicente has a room ready for you. Will you come? The aguardiente had not quite left Dick Rivers's brain. He rose and grinned, slapping his friend's shoulder. Thanks, old man. I hope it's not too far from Flores. Don Pablo's face grew cold. Vicente will have arranged whatever he thought would make you most comfortable. He will take you. Your luggage will be there. If you find you need anything, you can tell me later. Not coming along? No, I have something to attend to here. The hacendado turned to Vicente in the doorway and spoke to him in a sharp whisper. Send Manuelita to me here at once. The steward bowed and plodded out with drooping, aged shoulders. Pablo Gutierrez stood looking out of the barred window whence two old men had once watched for his, or Juan's, return. Soft as a shadow, Manuelita drifted into the room and took her stand beside the big desk. There was impudence, if you like, in the tilt of the flower behind her ear, the swing of her hips that tossed her petticoats. None the less, she was a terribly frightened child. The hacendado made her wait there, tense, for a few moments before he turned from the barred window. His arms were folded, his face in shadow. There is no room on the hacienda, Manuelita, for a niña who disobeys orders. She fingered her petticoat. Don Fernando would never have asked me to wait upon a stray dancing woman. If Don Fernando had chosen, he would have done just that. Doña Flora is my guest. The whole hacienda shall wait upon her if I say so. Not I, senor. Then be off with you. Where, senor? The simple question floored Don Pablo. He brooded a moment, arms still folded. The children of Santa Eulalia are my children, to be fed and clothed and cherished, but not if they are disobedient. She simply repeated, Where, senor? Into the hills alone, if I say so, he answered roughly, striking the desk suddenly with his hand. Manuelita edged forward, eyeing that hand. She bent over, took his fingers in hers an instant, and touched her forehead to them, a natural gesture of fealty. Then she stood upright. I am a woman, Don Pablo. You? A child. Was that why the senor forbade my marriage to Benito? Because I was a child? She could not see the flush that mounted to his very eyes. God knows why I did that. If Benito had not taken Carmen, Don Miguel should marry you to him tomorrow. As it is, Santa Eulalia cannot drive a girl out to stray among the hills. But if you stay, you obey orders. All orders of every sort. But that, senor. He stepped close to her, his eyes blazing darkly. Then keep out of my sight. Get to the Concepcion village at dawn and help old Rosa feed the vaqueros. When my guests have gone, you can come back and do the penance Don Miguel shall award you. If I set eyes on you before then, you shall be sent to Ciudad Juarez, an outcast, to earn your bread in a factory. Do you hear? He struck her smartly on the cheek, then folded his arms again. She went quickly, and Pablo Gutierrez did not see her for many days. On the morrow the master of Santa Eulalia set forth early. It was branding time for some thousands of cattle, and he always looked to these things himself. He had expected Rivers to join him. The sight of Santa Eulalia stretching to every horizon would explain better than any mere talk all that had happened to change him from the Wharton Cameron that Rivers had known. But Rivers chose to keep Doña Flora company at home. "It was a mistake to bring her," he confessed. "She shall go back, but today I think I'll stick here with her. You don't want her nosing all over the place alone, do you? And in a royal rage by evening." Pablo looked to his spurs before answering, in a tone of boredom. "No rages are royal hereabouts, my friend, except mine. There's not a man, woman, or child on the place that would give a damn for her or her temper. If she started to smash things, Vicente would lock her up. And why should Doña Flora be angry? I did not invite her, but I have given orders that she should be made as comfortable as the establishment permits. I have sent one girl to Coventry because she would not wait on your friend." "Flora would love that. May I tell her?" Dick's blue eyes beamed. "As you choose. The girl had to be punished, but not out of compliment to Doña Flora. Really, Dick, she's better out of this." "Oh, I quite agree with you. I thought perhaps we'd all be good pals together for a little, but—" He looked the hacendado up and down, shrewdly, pleasantly. "You're not what I'd call a pal for anybody these days. They say responsibility sobers. Probably that's it." "Probably, yet I want a pal badly." He frowned a little as he quieted his horse automatically. "What do you want me to do for Doña Flora?" "Pay her a little more attention. Tell her you are perishing to see her dance. She can shake a mean leg, and she's probably dying to show off. Oh, just loosen up a little. She thinks you hate her." "I don't hate people at sight. Pray ask her, for me, to dance this evening. Vicente can fetch in some guitar boys. And tell Vicente to bring up champagne. Adios." He cantered off with a wave of his hand. End of section 5. Section 6 of Conquistador. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Conquistador by Katharine Fullerton Gerould. 5. Part 2. Doña Flora, who affected rage at the notion of being ordered to dance, was secretly delighted. 24 hours of Santa Eulalia had reduced her to literal tears and a certain amount of foot-stamping. She was somewhat appeased, to be sure, by Dick's choosing to stay at home, to wander through the wide arcades with her, instead of riding afield with his rich but taciturn friend. Don Ricardo said the hacendado was Americano, too, but that was absurd. He was a Creole of the Creoles. Not, however, the kind she was in the habit of seeing in the theaters and cafes of Mexico. He had been barely civil to her, the old-fashioned sort. Yes, she would dance, especially as there was to be champagne. That was the wine for a woman of the world. Doña Flora could indeed shake a mean leg. The whole household did its best to crowd in behind Pablo and Dick, who constituted the official audience. Naturally there was not room, as Vicente's orders and smart slaps told them. Some scores of them squatted in the patio, hoping for an occasional glimpse of twinkling feet, as the mass inside stirred and shifted and applauded. Doña Flora, back at her métier, felt happier. If she could charm the young bloods of the town, she could have her way with the vaqueros and peons. Dark faces beyond the torchlight reminded her of her own beginnings. Down in Anwaxaca village, she suddenly decided to eschew the ballet steps and renew her childhood. So, imperiously, she removed the guitar from the hands of one adoring youth, and summoned him to dance with her. He leaped to his feet and swung Doña Flora of the Teatro Español into the crude and passionate measures. Pablo, chin in hand, his cigarette forgotten, watched them intently. Yes, this was life, as these souls he mastered knew it. No wonder they thought him cold. Him, Don Pablo Gutierrez, who always left the fiesta when the bullfight was over, the drinking but half done, and the dancing just begun, riding home alone in the moonlight. This was what they understood, the subtle yet shameless dance of mating. No wonder that, even at Santa Eulalia, Don Miguel and his sacraments could barely keep abreast of the tide of sexual encounters. The pushing crowd did not encroach upon him and his guest, but he felt the accelerated breath, the illumined eyes, all about him in the dark. He turned and looked curiously at Rivers. Strange to think that Rivers was more used to this than he, Rivers in his white flannels, with his American towhead and the Bostonian accent in his slang. But Rivers was not used to this. Two Mexican peasants enacting the primitive emotions without footlights. This was very far from the Teatro Español, and he saw Flora through a mist of strangeness. An ancient male reaction stirred in him. Of course one didn't make a scene, but Flora was reverting too far for him to follow. It must stop. He rose and snapped his fingers, more for the physical relief of the gesture than as a warning or an order. But Doña Flora heard it, and, with one last beautiful spring of her lithe body, clung for one mere breath to her partner, kissed him, and dropped away. The dance was over, and swinging her hips and smiling, she nestled at Rivers's feet and asked for champagne. Don Pablo gave it to her with his own hands, and a rich compliment as well. Vicente cleared the great room. Flora's whilom partner lounged out to boast of his prowess and his kiss. The patio hummed ever more faintly as folk drifted off to their corners and their huts. The moon rode high and undisturbed. Don Pablo, bowing low to Doña Flora, wished her all manner of fine dreams. He clapped his hands, and a few sleepy Indian girls sprang from nowhere to fetch screened candles and light the Senora across the great patio to her room. She yawned with great sweetness, murmured, "I am very tired," and left them. Rivers lighted another cigarette. "I am tired, too, if you'll believe it. Another minute and I should have knocked that boy down. Jealous as hell. Think what it would be like to be married to a woman who gave you moments like that." "But one isn't," said Pablo quietly. "I know one isn't, and even so, it's rotten. Rotten enough for even a casual chap like me. I'll be going home next month." He flicked his ash off and stared at the moon. Presently he turned and put an arm about his host's embroidered shoulder. "I've been doping it out today, and I see most of it. I see all this grandeur is a kind of manifest destiny. But what's worrying me, Cameron, is just one thing. Whom the devil are you going to marry?" "I don't know." Pablo shifted his weight slightly, that Dick's arm might rest more firmly on his shoulder. "Because you can't live forever like this. You've got women aplenty round here, I suppose." He hesitated. "All there are," Pablo replied simply, "but I have never taken any one of them." "Well, exactly. I might have known it. You always were like that, a cross between Galahad and Captain Kidd. But marriage is a thing you can't avoid forever. Property always necessitates a succession. It's all very well for me, who have neither estate nor profession, and just about enough money to amble around on. But you're tied to your Mexican paradise. I've got Flora, as it were. It must be damn lonesome sometimes, Cameron." "Since my uncle died, it is." Rivers removed his arm and lighted another cigarette. The lights went out in Doña Flora's apartment across the patio. Pablo noted it idly as he struck a match. The two started then to walk up and down the deep arcade. "And it isn't as if you weren't human, old man. You may look like a portrait of yourself by Velázquez, but you can't fool me. I used even to think you were fairly susceptible when we were all in college." "I have always been susceptible, as you call it," Don Pablo returned. "Very, only not promiscuously so, unfortunately." "Meaning me, I suppose," Rivers grinned. "Oh, well, I play fair, and they always laugh when I say goodbye. I'm just a vacation from the real business of life, and in point of fact, I prefer it that way. I was angry enough to kill Flora tonight, but in 6 months I shall probably remember the scene with laughter. We'll hope so, at least. But you, old boy, No, I don't see it at all, and it rather worries me. None of my business, of course. Very much your business, as long as I let you discuss it. Speaking of my susceptibility, he stopped, but Rivers finished for him. What has become of Dory Mayne? You were certainly susceptible in that direction at one time. Hanged if I can think of another at the moment. Well, what has become of her? The words came sharply, like an order. Don't catch me up so. I'm not one of your serfs. By the way, Don Pablo, if you ever come back to the States, you'll have to forget you're a hacendado or whatever. We don't have them up there. With us, a man is apt to express his wishes in the conditional mood. Dory Mayne, she's much as usual, I fancy. Older, of course, like the rest of us. Not married? There was incredulity in the tone. Not so far as I know. That is very extraordinary. I should have thought she would have married long ago. Several men wanted her, I seem to remember. How could she have escaped it? Girls escape whatever they want to escape. At home. Perhaps you have forgotten. Perhaps I had. If you're really asking me about Dory Mayne, I'd say, for pure guess, not knowing the lady intimately, that Wharton Cameron went off to build a measly little railroad and never came back. No. The vehemence of his tone startled Rivers. Well, I only guessed. Then you have been guessing wrong. She never cared a straw for the young man you call Wharton Cameron. Of course, I don't pretend to know, but I'm not alone in my opinion. As you say, she was popular, and everybody has to find some answer to a riddle like, why doesn't she marry? We were boy and girl. I shouldn't have dared ask her to marry me, even if I could have afforded to. Certainly I never did. I feel sure she would have refused me if I had. Probably she would, Rivers said soothingly. Certainly she would if she could see you in this place, in those clothes, with your hand on that knife, and hear you spit out Spanish to your slaves. You've got even Flora cowed, and she has probably seen your kind before. He yawned. Good night, Pablo. Never thought I should twist my tongue round that, but it comes quite easily. There's mighty little Cameron left. Good night. They parted, Pablo Gutierrez dismissing Vicente and inspecting the keys with a nod, went to his own stone-floored chamber. It had been made more comfortable in many ways, and was now, for all its primitive quality, the handsomest apartment in the hacienda. Personal possessions and certain luxuries surrounded him there, though the barred windows still were unglazed. He undressed quickly, among the many candles, then looked for a book, yet finally chose none. Instead, he went to the great wardrobe and took out the clothes that Wharton Cameron had worn when the ferrocarril de Hermosillo y Santa Rosa had been abandoned. Quickly he donned the whole costume, even to the shoes and the spiral puttees. Everything was speckless. His faded Stetson hat he set on the table, his pistol near it. From a drawer he took his old briar pipe, which nowadays he never smoked. Then his khaki shirt flung open at the neck. He sank back in a huge chair, pulled at his pipe, and gazed at his crossed and putteed legs. For the first time in 3 years he tried deliberately to think and feel himself back into Wharton Cameron's skin, into Wharton Cameron's soul. Since the day when Hernando Luca had sped him on his tortuous way to the hacienda, he had been steadily forsaking Wharton Cameron. Now he would see how far he had gone upon that path. Cortez had had his Noche Triste, different from this, but no less decisive. Dory Mayne. Was he Pablo Gutierrez, hacendado, or was he Wharton Cameron, engineer? Don Fernando had forsaken him too early. Another year, and Don Fernando could perhaps have molded him wholly. But even Don Fernando realized that he could not promise about a woman. What had he promised Don Fernando on that sad and difficult night? To confess to Don Miguel and come back to the sacraments. Well, that he had done. Don Miguel, as his uncle had prophesied, made him no difficulties. A caballero believes in God. That was all. The form does not matter. The Camerons had let that pass. But he had promised something else, for Santa Eulalia's sake, to get a son. He had taken no steps towards fulfilling that duty. His lips twisted grimly. Could he go through the motions of Creole courtship? He looked down at his khaki sleeve, at the hand holding the worn briar. Never. That was not what he meant by a wife. A wife was the friend of your spirit, not a giggling beauty half glimpsed between a duenna and a grilla. If Don Fernando had lasted, he might perhaps have swayed his son. As it was, his son was Pablo Gutierrez for all else, but Wharton Cameron still for a bride. The woman of the hacienda, that even would have been different, but never should any priest marry him except to a girl he loved as the Camerons loved their wives. How, from the depths of Chihuahua, ringed about with the miles of his estate, to reach her, that possible wife? Dick Rivers might come and go, but he was Pablo Gutierrez. The light sweat beaded his forehead as he thought intensely and forced himself to think in English. A son for Santa Eulalia. Yes, there must be a son. Even Rivers saw that. A wife? Well, he wanted one, God knew, but Dory Main came between him and every vision of a bride. He clenched his hands on the chair arms and bit hard on his pipe. That foolishness of Dick's. Steps on the stair and a knock on the door. "Enter," he said, startled. "I have come, Don Pablo." It was a woman's voice. Doña Flora sidled into the room. Her eyes encountered the young American engineer in the chair. Her lips parted. She went whiter than her own powder. Very slowly, Pablo Gutierrez rose. He realized how the look of him had shocked her, and laughed. "You desired something, Senora?" The girl struggled with her own terror, for terror, no less, was what the strange figure had caused her. "Americano!" she gasped. "Yes, Americano. Did not our friend Rivers tell you? I seldom wear these clothes, but they fit me, Senora. They are mine." Doña Flora, however, was fast regaining her self-control and her native impudence. There was a real Americano asleep downstairs, and she had been quite able to deal with him. She caught up a cloak that lay across a chair. "Permit me to conceal that shirt, which does not become you, Senor." She flung the cloak about his shoulders. Then she laughed. "And the pipe, Don Pablo?" She took it from his hand and laid it on the table. From her own girdle she produced a cigarette, lighted it at a candle, and handed it to him. "That is better. You are not Americano. You are a Creole. So am I." She walked across and leaped lightly to perch upon the bed, twisting her slim, uncorseted body gracefully in her scanty, brilliant dress. The hacendado did not remove the cloak. He played with its tassels and smoked his cigarette. "A Creole? You? Pardon me, Doña Flora, but that is one thing you are not. No woman without Indian blood can dance as you dance tonight. I have seen too many muchachas at the fiestas." She blazed at him. "Do you think, then, that I am one of your peon women? With an ankle like that," she pushed it toward him, "that Spanish men have fought each other to kiss." "Castiza, perhaps," he answered coolly. "But it does not matter. Did Don Ricardo send you here to ask me to kiss your ankle? Because I am quite willing, if that is what he wants. Only, after that, I must really bid you good night. It is very late. I am sure that Don Ricardo did not ask you to entertain me longer." "Don Ricardo!" She laughed, not unmusically. "Listen, Don Pablo." Flora left the bed and came over to him. With a movement difficult to forestall, she curled herself upon his knee. "I am Flora Calderon. They will tell you all about me in Mexico City. Don Ricardo is a joke. He is nothing to me. But you, I understand. A man." "Don Ricardo is no joke to me. He is my friend, my guest, and your lover. When you untangle all that, Doña Flora, you will see that I am no man for you." "But I love you. Por Dios! All the rest is nothing. Her hand felt under the cloak for his heart. It is enough compliment for him that I travelled under his escort. To you. See, your heart is beating, and here is Flora. She dropped her head on his shoulder. A gardenia in her hair assailed another sense. Pablo knew that this must end quickly if it was to end as he would have it. Putting forth his strength, he rose with Flora in his arms and set her on her feet, then drew back. All that means something to a Gutierrez. She stretched out her arms and consented to plead. Her voice was both wild and soft. You are a man. I am a woman. What does anything mean but love? He could not help the flush that burned his face and neck, but he threw back his head and stared at the dim rafters, not at her. You are a very charming person, no doubt, Doña Flora. My friend finds you so. Unfortunately, I do not feel your charm. You don't tempt me. Under the supreme brutality of his speech, she flinched, then grew very white. She fumbled blindly in her girdle, not for a cigarette this time. When she drew forth her hand and looked up wildly, she saw before her a grim, uncloaked figure in khaki and a pistol pointed not 2 feet from her arm. Don Pablo knew better than of old the meaning of fumbling hands. You would kill me? She murmured in fear. No, but I do not intend to be stabbed because a dancer from Mexico is piqued. The knife clattered to the floor. He picked it up and returned it to her, still covering her with the pistol. At the door she turned in a flood of tears. Yet I did love you, Don Pablo. Her rage had dropped suddenly. She was like a hurt baby. I am sorry, Doña Flora. His lips barely moved to emit the level tones. He must not touch her, he knew, even with his fingertips. That would be the end. But he shot his pistol into the holster at his belt and stood before her, defenseless, shrugging his shoulders. It is simply one of those things that might not be. Tomorrow you will realize. I am deeply flattered, but I should be no caballero if I permitted myself to dwell upon your charms. Good night. Caballero, you? Americano, and trash at that. She hissed her way out into the corridor. She did not hear his racked whisper that followed. I am sorry. I am sorry. Nor could she see the Americano huddled in his chair, torn and miserable, after the bolt had been shot behind her. He had wanted passionately to choke, to torture her for her cheapness, her treachery, but he had wanted no less passionately to lift her and carry her yonder into the shadows, to bury his face in her perfumed breast and let her soft arms hold him fast. This Doña Flora was not to know. Pride and hatred sped her forth from the hacienda the next day. She was bored, she was ill, she was miserable, she explained to Rivers. She was used to the great world, not these up-country places with up-country manners. Rivers accompanied her to Chihuahua in the big, comfortless carriage with the martial escort. The hacendado stood by the carriage step to lift her in. Doña Flora affected not to notice him, but his arm compelled her. He lifted his sombrero and looked deep into her eyes. Adios, Doña Flora, he murmured. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it tenderly. Adios, Senora, he repeated. He handed her in. I thought you'd be sorry to see her go, called Rivers in French. I shall be awfully miserable when I come back without her. It would be unkind to keep her here against her will, answered Pablo. That Santa Eulalia would never attempt to do. But I owe her many thanks. In the bright sunlight he could say it easily enough, and her last glance showed that she half forgave. She stretched out her hand, just as the horses started, bent down and touched his hair with her fingers. Caballero, she whispered quickly, when you come to Mexico, senor, we shall see if you are caballero still. Presently the carriage was a mere speck beyond the great gates. Don Pablo put on his sombrero and turned to the business of the day. She was a hussy, yet in his heart of hearts a man cannot be wholly ungrateful. He had held it his duty to insult her, but he hoped he had shown her that he by no means loathed her. She must certainly understand that he would not give her away to Dick. Yet he thought her not worth the little fingernail of half the girls on the hacienda. Logic is somewhat obscured in these matters. He ordered his horse brought, then called to Vicente. "You can send for Manuelita at the end of the week. Old Rosa will have to give her up. She is clever, and Luisa can use her in the dairy." "Manuelita has always busied herself about the linen, senor." Don Pablo shook his head. "She is not to be about the house, under my feet. I am much displeased with her." "Senor?" Vicente hesitated. "Well?" It is hard to say it." "Then do not try." Don Pablo strode away, and old Vicente waggled his head like a turtle in the sun. End of section 6. Section 7 of Conquistador. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Conquistador by Katharine Fullerton Gerould. 6. Pablo Gutierrez was not an introspective person. Weeks, months of much business, of complicated though monotonous routine, made up his life. He was like a man who looks only at stated intervals into his mirror and marks only then the changes that have come. It was written that he should come to consciousness of himself by way of a succession of dramatic hours. Only with those dramatic hours have we time to deal, and from his gesture in each significant moment we must divine how life had worked on him since the last. A fragmentary record, yet to Pablo Gutierrez himself, revelation came only as a series of shocks. He was not one to feel his own pulse or count his own heartbeats daily. So our episodic tale is less unfaithful than it might seem to the young conquistador. Rivers came with Doña Flora. Doña Flora departed after facing Wharton Cameron, evoked by Pablo like a ghost from the sandy grave of his career. Rivers stayed on, but not for long. He missed Flora, was the slave of his light passion. When he spoke whimsically thereof to his friend, Don Pablo's eyes grew darker and less fathomable, and his speech slowed. Rivers could not know that Flora had helped reveal Pablo to himself. A worthless little hand holding up a candle to his heart. He could not know, for Pablo might not tell him, that her gesture of unsolicited surrender had tipped a balance that hung poised. That, after that night, Pablo Gutierrez found himself setting fidelity high above certain other traditional virtues. Pablo was no fool. He knew that Floras were like that, but the sheer ugliness of her behavior made him turn his back on her and her kind for a solution. Wife or mistress, he told himself, a woman must be faithful, or one's gorge rises at the spectacle of her. Rivers, chattering of his charmer, got little response. Did Pablo then, communing with his classmate, revert wholly to his Cameron heritage? By no means. Santa Eulalia was far more real to him than Dick. Reminiscence, even, dried up as soon as it gushed forth. Rivers's world held only one thing, now, for Pablo, Wharton Cameron's dream of a wife. Certain words of Dick's had struck deep that earlier night, though Pablo never reverted to their substance or their import. Those latter days of Rivers's visit were wasted, for both of them. All that Rivers could do for his friend had been done before Doña Flora left, and it turned out that Pablo could do little for Dick. Only a meaningless affection held them together. Rivers had told his host disturbing things of Dory Main, freshening a vision. He had provided Doña Flora to teach Pablo that, in the matter of charming him, a light woman had limitations. Those were tremendous facts, though they were scarcely due to any conscious benevolence of Dick's. Meanwhile, Dick, as a guest, interfered seriously with the conduct of life, and, as a companion, his preoccupation with Flora distinctly spoiled him. It must be said, too, that Pablo's habit of mind and life, Creole and feudal both, made him strange to Rivers. They parted with a clinging hand grip, but without regret. Even on the vastest ranch, certain seasons are slacker than others. In those slack seasons, young Creole masters disport themselves in Mexico City or go to Europe. Don Pablo Gutierrez did neither, but some 2 months after Rivers's departure, he prepared for a journey. Francisco, trained by Don Fernando, would oversee the hacienda, Vicente the household, Don Miguel morality. If he sweated in secret with apprehension, no one of his great family suspected it. The wallet that he put in his pocket was thicker now. It held legal papers of many sorts, indicted by Don Luis, and signed by the 2 last Gutierrez. On the eve of his departure, he sought out Don Miguel and confessed. He would receive communion at dawn. These things were not allowed to trouble Don Pablo. Don Miguel was skillful, caballero too. Before mounting to his stone-floored chamber for a long sleep, the hacendado called Vicente into his place of business. "Where is Manuelita?" "Somewhere about the dairy, one supposes, senor." "Find her, if you can, and send her here. If she is not found within half an hour, no matter. It is not important." He drummed nervously on the big desk with his fingers until Manuelita came, shepherded into the official room by Catalina. Pablo had not seen her since the day he had sent her to the Concepcion village as punishment for disobedience. She had, according to orders, kept out of his sight. "I am going away for a few weeks, Manuelita." "Yes, senor." She did not dare lift her eyes to his face, but her very eyelids worked with adoration. A mouse would have known. Don Pablo, for that matter, had known long since. Half the girls in the hacienda were in love with him. You will see that, unless he were an actual monstrosity, this would be so. Vicente tells me that you are especially good at your needle. In my absence, you may come back to Catalina and the linen. Do I go back to the dairy on your return, Don Pablo? Doubtless. It is not for me to disobey, Don Pablo, but if you would consider that it is kinder, then, to leave me in the dairy, where I am doing well, your Excellency might then change your mind. I thought the patio would be gayer for you, and Catalina misses your fingers. I must do as I am bid, she answered quietly, still with bowed head. But it is not kind. Listen, child, and look at me. She raised her head obediently. For Manuelita she was very meek, he reflected, but he could not know how much she dreaded his eyes. You are very pretty, he said calmly, one of the prettiest. There must be plenty of young fellows about who want to marry you. Yes, senor. Why not? Why not, indeed? I will tell Don Miguel that he is to marry you to any one you choose, even if I am not here, and when I come back, I will see that you have a dowry. No, senor, you cannot make me marry any one of them. I do not wish to make you marry anyone. But I like to see the young girls settled, Manuelita, especially when they are as pretty as you. I don't want any more fights over you. They are a nuisance. Can I help it if fools fight when they are drunk, because a flower dropped out of my hair? Tell Vicente to keep them away from mezcal. She spoke scornfully, with no hint of servility. Men are men, and women are women. Don Pablo shrugged his shoulders and waved his cigarette. Men are pigs, senor. I have a request to make. She waited. Well, what is it? You must go back to the dairy when I return. I want no impertinent girls about the house. I shall not leave the dairy, with your permission, senor, but I can read and write. What of it? You do not wish to become my secretary, I suppose? No, senor, but I should be grateful if you would request Don Miguel to give me religious instruction. After your return, I should like permission to go to a convent in Chihuahua. Pablo smiled a little. A convent, Manuelita? Nonsense. You are too pretty for a convent. It is not the life for a girl like you. You would miss the music and the chatter and the fiestas. Absurd. Talk to Don Miguel, if you choose, but he will laugh at you. He rose. Try to fall in love with one of the quarrelsome youths before I come back, Manuelita. I regret, senor, I cannot. You are always difficult, Manuelita. He sighed involuntarily. As long as you are straying about unmarried, you will be a thorn in my flesh, subversive of order, always attempting to set up your own will, making trouble among the vaqueros. It would be much better to send you away entirely. Much better, Don Pablo, but only to the convent. You are silly, Manuelita. She angered him unaccountably with her pretense of a vocation. A girl like that, with provocation in every flutter of her skirts, and human passion in every sweep of her eyelashes. I refuse no one to God. But you were meant to be a wife and the mother of many children. Only plenty of babies could tame you, Manuelita, I think. He spoke roughly, the stark truth that he felt. She lifted her eyes to him, and their clear import did not soothe his anger. May I remain in the dairy until you return, Don Pablo, or must I come to Catalina and the linen, and return to the dairy then, that you may not be offended by the sight of me? He shrugged his shoulders. You may do as you choose during my absence. If you do not marry, we may perhaps have to send you farther afield. But I will not recommend you to any Mother Superior as a bride of heaven. The tears overflowed her eyes, enlarging and deepening them uncannily. Then I will walk to Chihuahua and fling myself against the gate. Don Miguel knows that I am a good girl. She stepped suddenly forward and seized his hand, gazing hungrily up into his austere face. But why, Don Pablo? She asked passionately. I am your servant and you are my master. It is not true that I am disobedient, except that once, and I have done penance. Why can I find no favor with you? Though you are master, you are a man, and I am a woman. Could you not pity me a little? Let me go my way in peace. Why, Don Pablo? She reiterated her cry. There is something I do not understand. A caballero does not stoop to hate a girl like me. Her bitter penance had obliterated all memory of high hopes, now months old and immemorially dead. The cry of perplexity was from her heart. Don Pablo sighed. She would understand better, perhaps, in a few weeks. He could say nothing more to her now. He laid his hand on her head. I do not hate you, Manuelita. You made me angry once, but that is forgotten. I do not like to have you sad. Why cannot you be like the others? They give me no trouble. What trouble have I given, senor, since? He stroked her wet cheek lightly. None intentionally, perhaps, but you are too pretty. At any moment there will be knife work. You shall have a handsome dowry, Manuelita, if you will marry Francisco's boy, and a good adobe house, not a jackal. Why not a dowry for the convent, senor? Because I know you would be unhappy. Not unhappier than this. She pulled his hand down and kissed it despairingly, then flung it from her and stumbled out of the room without waiting for permission to depart. Pablo looked down at his hand whereon the kiss, it seemed to him, still lay intact. He felt as if a dog had licked it and was moved, as a man may be. The next day, at sunrise, he started for the north. End of section 7. Section 8 of Conquistador. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Conquistador by Katharine Fullerton Gerould. 7. Part 1. An extraordinary Indian summer had kept the Maines late out of town, and it was in a garden that Pablo Gutierrez waited for Dory to come to him. He had not written, he had not telephoned, he had merely informed himself and taken a chance. His Gutierrez tendency to do all things in decorous order was swept away by a passionate personal determination to meet the girl unprepared, to read the truth in the unrehearsed first glance. He remembered what Dick Rivers had said about frightening her with the hacendado's clothes. Well, his clothes were American enough. He looked down at them, uncomfortable too for a man who had grown used to a totally different set of discomforts. Dory Mayne stepped into the garden and saw him standing at the end of a path, his thin brown hand hovering over a chrysanthemum. Though she knew in a vague way the facts, the strange name of Pablo Gutierrez meant to her only that there might be news out of Mexico of an old friend. She could not have conceived of the man himself's being announced thus. He turned quickly to the faint stir of her skirts. "Wharton Cameron!" She colored faintly like a rose, too fair for a blush to burn her face. "Wharton Cameron," she repeated softly, then was quiet, as if stricken. He gripped her hand in both his and stared at her, but her own eyes dropped. She had not remembered the perilous, deep blackness of his. They shattered the silence of 4 years like a thunderclap. "Dory, Dory, look at me," he murmured. He needed her eyes. Only her eyes could tell him. But though she let him keep her hand, she could not yet give him her eyes. She looked at his slender waist, his broad shoulders, even, with a little dart upward, at his smooth black hair. She could not yet brave his eyes. You are so different," she murmured. "But I always hoped I should see you again, Wharton. Why did you stay away so long?" He remembered suddenly that her voice had always been like that, like the glint of silver, and like a running stream. He trembled. "Let us sit down," he said quietly. A man could not be expected to manage his legs and his heart both, and think besides. "I came as soon as I could. I think I can make you understand." They sat down then, on a long garden bench, under the kind autumnal sun, and now Dory's eyes fluttered over his face. "You really are Wharton Cameron?" He laughed. "I was Wharton Cameron." "And you went away," she said quietly, "to build a railroad. And you never came back. You found your mother's people and stayed with them a long, long time, and they have changed you. But now you have come back. Are you Wharton Cameron?" she asked again. Pablo smiled. "Look at me once, straight in the eyes, and see. That is the only way you can know." She did as he bade her, then. Her blue eyes met and contended with his for a little, then fell. Yet Dory Mayne, for all her fairness, was no weakling. "Tell me all about it, Wharton," she said finally. "No one has known very much about you. I did not expect ever to see you again. Did you ever build the railroad? He told her about Luca's swoop and the flight of the whole personnel, dwelt for once on the detail of his journey to the hacienda, even told her of the trip to Hermosillo, omitting Juan, and his disclosure of the buried money bags to the mayor. He skipped then and spoke of Rivers's visit, not mentioning Doña Flora. It was a curious narrative, for he pulled out of his past only the moments when he had been, or tried to be, Wharton Cameron. He had an instinct to prove that lost identity, to build for her the bridge that connected Wharton Cameron and Pablo, but leaving Pablo out made a disconnected tale, and he himself grew impatient. It was not for this he had come, yet he wanted to reassure her before striking to the heart of the matter. He could not be sure whether he had read her eyes aright, and she was so chary of a direct glance. "It is a strange story," she answered, when he had finished. "There is a lot I don't make out, but you stayed in Mexico, I know. Could you travel about in those bad years?" "I did not travel about," he smiled, "except that Santa Eulalia is big enough to travel about on." "I was always afraid," she said softly. "They said no American's life was worth a copper coin. I have not been an American these last years, from head to foot, a Creole." "You wore the costume?" A slight impatience stirred him. "Why call it a costume? I wore the clothes a man must wear who is in the saddle all day among his vaqueros. I dressed as befitted my station in life, of course." "Tell me," she said after a little, "have you truly come back to us?" "I have apparently come back to you." His emphasis left no doubt of his meaning. She flushed and drew back a little into her corner of the bench, but after a moment she turned and scanned him with a cooler courage than she had at first been able to muster. Pablo felt her eyes at work all over him. This he must bear, for it was her right. But he set his teeth under the ordeal. That which he had once been endured her examination in steely patience. That which he had lately become felt a slow anger stirring. Don Pablo Gutierrez had forgotten the dispassionate appraisal of a woman's eyes. He turned suddenly and caught her hand, facing her. "Por Dios," he muttered, then wrenched himself back to a vision of the world such as they two had once known. He took his turn at staring then, but only to force his eyes to see her as, closed or opened on strange horizons, they had seen her hovering these 4 years. If Dorimane was intent on every minute difference, his eyes were violently insisting on the impossibility of change. The contact of her hand, which she did not yet withdraw, made the task easier. He bent closer to her. "I have come back to you, Dory," he repeated. "I love you. I have always loved you. He turned his head away for an instant, for the words burned his throat as they came. "I have nothing to offer you but Santa Eulalia and myself. But I beg you to take them." Deeply disturbed by his gathering tears, he let go her hand and folded his arms, looking straight before him down the garden walk until his eyes ceased to smart. "You could have written." Her voice was very low. Pablo Gutierrez turned back to her then. He was dismayed at her ignoring of his direct plea. But his keen eyes had not been wholly dupes of memory. This, for all her softness and fairness, was a woman who would answer only in her own good time. "Until I saw Dick Rivers a few months since, I should not have dared hope that you would even remember me. I supposed you were married." "Married? I? To whom, pray?" "How should I know? To anyone." Dorimane laughed lightly. "I am not so easy to please as that. Anyone will by no means do." "Thank God," he murmured. "If only I will. Can't you answer me, Dory?" "After 4 years," she said calmly, "I have a right to ask for an hour. 4 years of utter silence give you no right to be impatient. I think I loved Wharton Cameron once. I am not sure whether I love him now or not. It is not always safe to go away and let a girl grow into a woman alone. But if you loved me once, Dory, he pleaded, his lips almost touching her hair. I have always loved you. Sometimes I tried to think I did not, but within a year I have become intolerably sure. If you will not have me, I shall never marry. But if you ever loved me, love me now. She twisted herself lightly out of what was nearly an embrace, and spoke a little wildly. You must not make it harder for me. It is not fair. You are so different. How can I know? I was at peace, and you come suddenly. So strange and changed. You must give me time. Pablo drew away from her and composed himself with stern grace to another position. I will give you all the time you need, Dory, he said quietly, but there are some things about which time will only confuse you. He smiled. Will you let me kiss you once? She shook her head. Not yet. Not yet, please, she protested. He frowned faintly. You may be very sure that I shall not kiss you until you let me, but it is the quickest way of finding out. If I could change you back, I would find out in that way, she answered quietly, but it is going to take weeks or months to make you over, to turn you into Wharton Cameron again. You are not Wharton Cameron now. You are what your card said, Don Pablo Gutierrez. Of course, I could not marry Don Pablo Gutierrez. I do not even know him. But stay with me for a while and I may realize that, you are really the man I knew. Not weeks or months, Dory, he answered. My life is not here, and if you do not love me enough to let me kiss you once, you cannot love me enough to wish to be my wife. You do not understand, the girl said. Perhaps if we talk a little, I can make you understand better. She smiled at him. You offered me Santa Eulalia and yourself. I am very proud that you offer me yourself. Perhaps. A strange look came into her eyes. I shall take you. But what of Santa Eulalia? Do you mean that that is a wedding gift? A wedding gift, surely. Does not a man endow his wife with all he possesses? It is a vast estate, I judge. You are a rich man, perhaps, Wharton, after all. I may be called a rich man, I suppose. It was good of your uncle, did you say? To leave it to you. Is there anyone else, any other relative to take it off your hands if you come home? Pablo Gutierrez's hand trembled suddenly. Then he laughed. Alone at Santa Eulalia, alone. On his fevered journey northwards, he had planned it all another way. He was to look in her eyes and see, if she loved him, all things would be well. Santa Eulalia was a coat he must wear, but only a coat, and she would not even let him kiss her, though he more than suspected that of the blood in her veins he could show himself the true master. But he had promised, fool that he was, to wait her permission. He felt for, and found, a Spanish punctiliousness of tone. She should never say he was not honest with her. I hope you love me, Dory. If you do, I cannot see that anything else matters. But you shan't say that I hurried you, or teased you, or deceived you, even faintly. If we must talk of these things first, we will talk of them, as if you were a senorita in Mexico, he threw in grimly. Do not be unkind, Wharton, Dory murmured. You are so different that I find it hard. Be a little patient. I think you are Wharton Cameron at heart, but I must find you first. If I were not Wharton Cameron at heart, for you, I should not be here. But I am Pablo Gutierrez, all the same, in those other ways that need never matter to you and me. I thought you would want to know about Wharton Cameron, so I told you. But it is true, you must know, Pablo too. He paused a moment. He saw himself lifting Santa Eulalia in his hands to heaven, oblation-wise. I shall never come home in the sense you mean it, back to the States. My home is there, you see. My uncle, Don Fernando Gutierrez, adopted me as his son and made me his heir. His wife had no children. I am a Mexican citizen, of course, and a Catholic, naturally, I am pledged to carry on the task the Gutierrez have performed for generations. I promised Santa Eulalia is yours, because Santa Eulalia is mine. But it is not a thing to be passed about from one hand to another. I am Santa Eulalia, that is all. All? She quoted reflectively. All, you say. Your uncle seems to have had his way with you very easily. I do not think that the Wharton Cameron I knew would have given up everything he held dear for another country, another family, another faith. Perhaps you never knew the whole of Wharton Cameron, never knew that since his childhood he had been dreaming of his mother's house and his mother's people. It is true that he did not know then that Santa Eulalia would be home to him as no place had ever been. From the very first it welcomed me. I knew. I am a Gutierrez. That is all. I have taken the vows that a Gutierrez must take, to sustain the faith among the peons, to keep the hacienda what it has always been, the home of thousands of happy people from birth to death. Santa Eulalia is not their house, it is their country. I am master and friend and refuge. It is not always easy, but at least it is a man's work. It is my work, mine and my sons after me, as it has been since the first conquistadors. It did not occur to me, when I came, to tell you that I was rich. I did not think it mattered, but I am rich enough for you to do as you like at Santa Eulalia. You can rebuild, if you choose. The people and the cattle and the money are yours, as they are mine. How could it be otherwise? Though you were 10 times a Protestant, you would be the Senora, their mistress. He smiled. He could measure, none better, the difficulty of a Protestant Senora, but he cast it aside. He saw, in his heart, Dorry's fair hair taking the patterned moonlight of his great arcades, a marvel in that dark, half-Indian world. No, no, she murmured. It is so strange. The boy I knew could not have been like this, and it was that boy I thought I loved. So Dick Rivers was right, he said quietly. Dick Rivers? What do you mean? Dick said you would be frightened. I remember his every word. If you could see me in my own clothes, in my own place, with my hand on a knife, and hear me spit out Spanish to my slaves. But I thought Dick was a fool, because he knows nothing about love. I couldn't have imagined he was right. The Dorry Main I knew would have struck straight through any strangeness and seen a man's heart for what it was. She did not reply to that accusation, but cried out, Oh, why? Why didn't he send you back poor? Let you go? Why did that old man have to take you, body and soul? Had you no father, that your mother's brother should have all his way with you? If he had no children, couldn't he have found other kin? If you had never happened to go to him, someone else would have had Santa Eulalia, would he not? Pablo Gutierrez drew a deep breath. Yes, Juan. Where is Juan? Can you give it to him? Who is he? Pablo answered very coldly. He was the most promising of Don Fernando's illegitimate children. He is dead. He tried to stab me, and I shot him. You killed him? Yes, I killed him. And your uncle knew? Surely he knew. If Juan had succeeded in killing me, he would have been the hacendado now, I suppose. Don Fernando would have legitimized him. And it was to that dreadful old man you sold yourself. Worse than that, you loved him. You said so. Pablo Gutierrez rose from the bench and walked apart a moment, touching the late flowers with an idle hand. Thick and violent Spanish words crowded to his lips, but he was silent. He must not be angry. He must be patient with the one person in the world who could insult Don Fernando, from the depths of her ignorance, with impunity. Ignorance would not have served any other. The challenge or the blow would have come before this. She was the woman he loved. He must be gentle, very gentle with her. If he was hard beset, so probably was she. He came back to her, shaken with the very intensity of his own conviction. Listen, Dorry, dear, I cannot expect you to understand. because you have never seen a great Spanish gentleman of the old-fashioned kind. Don Fernando despised most modern Mexicans, as you would. As long as I knew him, honor and duty were all he lived for. And if you had once known him, you would have loved him, as he would have loved you. I did not sell myself. My mother had abandoned her people, and I went back to them. Once there, I saw my duty very plain. I didn't even give up my religion, for, of course, I was bred a Catholic, though, in the days when you and I knew each other best, I had forgotten about it. I gave up my father's country, because my mother's country called me. To show you how little my heart is Spanish, I refused to promise my uncle, on his very deathbed, to marry a Spanish girl. I promised him a son for Santa Eulalia, but I would not bind myself about my wife, because though I did not suppose I should ever see you again, I knew I loved you. More than that, Dory, more than that. I cannot take a wife except as you can take a husband, for love. Just there the Creole in me stops. When I ask you to marry me, I am Wharton Cameron. If I had been, in my heart, Pablo Gutierrez, do you think I would have come north on a casual word of Dick Rivers to give you a chance to break my life in two? No, Dory. If I had not been Wharton Cameron, I should have taken the easiest way. He smiled with an irony she hardly perceived, though she was looking at his face as he spoke. For everyone else in the world, even for our friend Dick, I am Pablo Gutierrez. But it is not precisely Pablo that I am offering you for a husband. If it were, this conversation would have been very different. I believe you love me, she said slowly. And I believe, in spite of all, that you love me. He put out his hands, and taking hers, drew her to her feet. Will you let me kiss you once, Dory? It means nothing, she answered strangely. It means a great deal to a man who has been longing to kiss you for 4 years. He bent nearer. But in that other sense, if you like, it shall mean nothing. She lifted her face to him freely and bravely. Pablo Gutierrez found Wharton Cameron's last bequest to him in that kiss. At last he let her go, gently. His lips felt as if they had pressed a rose to death. He searched her face quickly to see if the embrace had swept away suspicion. But Dory's eyes were closed, with tears escaping the shut lids. She leaned against his arm, as if she could not stand quite firmly. Her voice shook. It means nothing, she said again, and the words sounded stranger than before, but this time they angered him unaccountably. Does this mean nothing? His strong arm swept her to him again. The first kiss had been lingering and gentle, but there were both wedded hunger and dark triumph in this. Nothing, Dory? He murmured as he let her go. But this time she opened tearless eyes full upon him and released herself, standing before him alone. You should not have done that. I am not Pablo Gutierrez's wife. End of section 8. Section 9 of Conquistador. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Conquistador by Katharine Fullerton Gerould. 7. Part 2. Dory Mayne saw for an instant the very face that Manuelita had seen in the hour of her revolt. I am answered, he said sternly, and turned away. He drew a cigarette from his case and lighted it slowly. I ask your pardon, he continued, staring at the bright tip of the cigarette. I thought that perhaps you realized that you could be Pablo Gutierrez's wife without outrage to your senses. I was criminally stupid. The flush was fading slowly from his face, leaving it dark and inexpressive. Don Miguel, seeing him thus, would have laid a hand on the hacendado's arm and drawn him away from the patio for quiet consultation. Unluckily, there was no hovering angel in this northern garden. Dory had recovered herself wholly. You cannot take me by storm, Pablo. He started at the name, but said nothing, and she went on. Let us be very frank as we couldn't have been when we knew each other before. I could have told you 4 years ago that I should not mind your kisses in the way in which you mean. I suppose that is one reason why I never married anybody else. I am being very frank. You see, we are not children now. I am, just older and wiser, nothing more. But you have inherited a vast estate, land and cattle and slaves. They are slaves, I believe. Dick Rivers was right. You are thinking of me in the wrong terms, I fancy, Dory, he threw in humorously. Perhaps I shouldn't have quoted Dick's little joke. It is my business to keep my Indians good and to keep them happy. It's a man's job, as I told you. But if you think of me as a slave driver, you know Pablo Gutierrez as little as you ever knew Wharton Cameron. I don't doubt you are a good master. I don't doubt you make them happy. But I am not sure that Dick Rivers wasn't right. I am not sure that, at Santa Eulalia, I shouldn't be afraid of you. He laughed outright, throwing his dark head back, though his brows above his eyes were still knit with pain. Oh, come, Dory. Can a woman be afraid of a man who loves her as I love you? Be perfectly honest. Look at me. Can she? What in God's name is there to be afraid of? Is there anything at all? Look at me, he bade her again. She looked at him quietly, then shook her head. Looking doesn't help. I know you, and I don't know you. She dropped again to her garden bench, and he moved to stand in front of her. There is only one way, he spoke hesitatingly, in which a girl can be afraid of a decent man. I dislike to express things as you do not wish them expressed, but the facts are there. If you loathed having my arms about you, you would have a right to be afraid of me, as a husband. But you have admitted that you don't. I give you my word of honor that there is nothing else you need fear. I am unworthy of you, doubtless, but I am. He breathed shortly, quickly. Caballero, after all. I bring you love and reverence and everything I have, Dory. He lifted his hands slightly, as if to show that nothing was kept back. Chin on hand, she pondered a little. I want to be honest. I must be honest. Probably a woman is always afraid of something. What I am afraid of is such a vast thing. It is Santa Eulalia. Yours, he countered promptly. Yours to the last adobe hut in the last village. A woman cannot be afraid of what is her very own, to do what she likes with. Just what? She asked quietly. Do you mean by its being my own? To do what I like with? Pablo looked at her, perplexed. Why, what I say. If you said a hut should be pulled down, it should be, that very day. If you said this girl should go here or there, she would be gone like a shadow, as soon as you had done speaking. For you would love Santa Eulalia, and you would want only the good of every soul on the hacienda. Of course I could not let you be unkind or unjust, but you are not capable of being either one. They would all adore you. They would press about you to serve you. They would be made happy by the least little smile. Ah, and if not? If not, they should go. Go where? Away from Santa Eulalia, to another hacienda or a convent. She could not know why his voice roughened and he spoke harshly, and she was displeased. I should not care to play Providence, she answered coldly. I do not want so much for mine. I might not love Santa Eulalia as you do. I don't believe you could help it, when you once knew it. And Pablo's eyes, far-seeing, were set on the very end of the garden vista below them, where poplars pointed upwards. I think you would love the place to which your son was heir. You would love it for him. It could not help being yours then. The slow colour rose in her delicate face, but she did not reply directly to his words. Instead, she reverted to an earlier speech. You say that Santa Eulalia would be mine. You do not really mean that. Nothing is yours unless it is yours to throw away if you want to throw it away. What you really mean is that I should belong to Santa Eulalia. It is a little different. Pablo felt anger stir in his heart. Dory Mayne had spoken truth when she said that he was not quite Wharton Cameron. But he spoke very quietly. He must not mar this hour. I suppose I am doing what any man does when he asks a woman to marry him. I cannot help it if, the world over, a wife must share her husband's life. If a man who had to live in San Francisco or Bombay asked you to marry him, would you take it as an insult? But you seem to take it as an insult that I ask you to marry me because I live in Chihuahua, I think. He spoke with slow heat. I think you are splitting hairs because you do not love me. I think, his voice shook, you are determined not to let yourself love me. I had better go. Dory rose to stand again beside him and laid her hand on his arm. His face was still averted, but, without looking at her, he laid his left hand above her own. Please try to be a little more fair to me, my dear, she pleaded. You seem to expect me to answer you now. She laughed gently. Even if a man lived in Bombay, he would give me time. But you hold a pistol to my head like a highwayman. Indeed you do. No woman can say, offhand, that she will marry a man she hasn't seen for 4 years. If she can't, he shrugged his shoulders. Still he did not look at her. That I can't today doesn't mean that I couldn't, perhaps, next week, next month. Be reasonable, Don Pablo. Her hand stirred beneath his, and he lifted his own. I can't see it that way, Pablo mused. You love me enough, or you don't. Every day I stayed here, trying to make you think me back into Wharton Cameron, would make it worse, would make it less true. For I am Pablo Gutierrez, since I am Santa Eulalia. I would wait on your pleasure forever, but waiting wouldn't help. Doubtless I would give up Santa Eulalia for you, if I were not bound. Simply, I may not. I have promised. If it means hell for me, he cried, flinging his head up, I cannot help it. Death doesn't wait for a man to see his way clear. His voice slowed again as he thought aloud. What I think I mean is this, Dory. It would be strange and different for you until you are used to it. You are not part Spanish, as I am. Pablo turned his head slightly and looked sidelong at her golden cloud of hair. Then he shut his eyes quickly on that golden glimmer. If you loved me, you would be happy. But it would take the kind of love that a woman does not have to reason about, I suppose. What you would call romantic love. Irony smote his voice till it quivered. Ah, if you are not romance, what are you? She cried. That is what I am afraid of, to pay with my whole life and yours for romance. I tell you, if I could throw Santa Eulalia away, it would be different. I would marry Wharton Cameron. I would marry Pablo Gutierrez, perhaps, but I cannot marry Santa Eulalia. I do not belong there. It may be that you would grow to hate me. He seized both her hands quickly in his. I grow to hate you? You must be mad. What right have you to say such a thing to me? She faced him steadily. You are angry with me now, you see? Yes, I am angry. You are treating me lightly, and I have given you no cause. You are the only woman I have ever loved or shall ever love, and you tell me I might hate you. It is enough to make a man angry. If any man told me I could ever hate you, I would kill him. Ah, you have learned to kill, she said bitterly. He bit his lip till the pain dizzied him. Only so could he force his own silence. He dropped her hands and turned away, pacing the garden path. Dory fell into step with him, and so they walked mutely together. Neither could return to those last words of hers. After a few shaken moments, Dory Mayne spoke again. You will not wait, then, Don Pablo? Why should I wait? I think you have answered me for good and all, whether you meant to or not. If I am stopping here in your garden, it is because it is very hard to say goodbye. You must forgive me. I will go, presently. They stopped together by a stone-rimmed pool and stared into the brown water. "Don't you see," she said, so low that he had to bend over to hear, "that I am afraid of those vows you have made? You don't seem to realize that vows like that would bind your wife, too. You speak as if I could be free while you were bound, as if I had only to love you. You would not promise your uncle to marry a Spanish girl, you say, but—" He had almost to touch her cheek to hear. "You promised him a son. If I married you, you would make me bear you children. You would give me to Santa Eulalia, body and soul." She broke off in tears as quiet as her whisper. When at last she looked up, he had moved away from her and was standing with folded arms, staring down at her with narrowed eyes, as if from a great distance. His speech, when it came, was like a cloak flung about him. "No woman, permit me to assure you, will ever bear me a child against her will. I do not know what you think men have in their hearts when they ask you to marry them. I love you with my whole heart and soul, and asked you to share my life, nor is it a mean life, to be mistress of Santa Eulalia. Great ladies have thought themselves fortunate before this to rule there. No man thinks himself worthy of the woman he loves, but he offers what he can. You speak to me as if I had proposed some nameless horror to you. You could have refused me more graciously, I think. You could have flung me a kind word. I do not pretend to understand, but I shall not forget." His hand felt mechanically for the hilt of a knife to support it, but Don Pablo wore no knife, and the hand dropped. She ignored his mood, his tone, his whole attitude of cold relinquishment. "Do you mean," she asked breathlessly and low, "that you would not bind me with that vow? That I should be really free?" She stepped forward, lifting her hands a little towards him, though she did not look up at his face. "Because I do love you, Pablo." He bowed to her with formal grace as though she were a stranger. "I am good enough for you, it would appear. I am grateful, of course. But you have misunderstood me, I fear, señorita. I was asking you to be my wife, not my mistress." She looked at him then, stung into fearlessness. "I have said nothing to you so cruel as that. I will ask you to excuse me for a few moments. No." She put up her hand. "I wish to see you again. The sun will not set for another half-hour. I would rather you waited for me here. It is a question of your life and mine, and I must be alone for a little. And if we are to part, I will not, do you understand? I will not part from you in anger. There is enough love between us for a little kindness to come of it. You expect me not to mind your honesty. Why should you mind mine? You have done extraordinary things yourself, but you will not even let me say what I feel. I am going back to my own place for a little to be alone. I ask you, for both our sakes, to wait for me." Dory Mayne went swiftly back up the terraces, and Pablo watched her pale form disappear. Hope crept back into his heart, because in spite of their bitter words, she had bade him wait for her. She loved him, too, in some way he could not completely define. Not, he thought, mere passion, since, to a woman like Dory Mayne, passion can scarcely come uncomplicated and alone. For her it could be but a thread in the pattern, and what the pattern was he knew no more than ever. Convinced though he was that if she would take the risk, life would make all things clear. He could not force her to take it. It was the weight of her reason, not of his, that must sway her. And there, alone, she was pondering. What? The fair face of Santa Eulalia frightened her, and no words, no oaths of his could make her see that it held no threatening feature. Santa Eulalia rose before his eyes in a mighty vision. It hurt him that it should be traduced in a girl's mind, so far away. Little senseless questions came to shoot across his brain. Could he trust Francisco to get the cattle safely to Durango to be fattened? Would there be trouble in the northern villages, far from his eye, where some of the peons listened to stray agitators, but he cut himself off sharply from reminiscence. He must keep his mind blank and patient. Dory had withdrawn herself to think. Apart from him, he would never be angry with her again, not though she stabbed him over and over. By a stone-rimmed pool he smoked a cigarette, resting in a darkening arbor a second. Then, in the full crimson of sunset, Dory came back to him. He threw his third cigarette away, and stood waiting. Whatever rite she had performed in her solitude, she was now cooler, steadier, poised beyond the ebb and flow of emotion or caress. Some sense told him that their words now would all be essential. "Well, Dory?" Pablo smiled on her very gently. "I had to go away from you for a little. If you had been willing to stay on for a time and let us talk it out, more slowly, it might have been different. But you are probably right. I am old enough to know, and we might quarrel again and again if you stayed. You would not be happy here, I know. I should always be happy with you, wherever we were, but life here would not seem very real to me. In that sense, I should not be happy here. There it is, you see, Wharton." She went back to the earlier name as if it were the more beloved. "And I should not be happy there. Not even if you loved me?" "I do love you." "Then—" He stretched out his arms to her. "Then, Dory, what else matters?" "Life matters," she answered calmly. 4 years ago you could have taken me by storm. I am old enough to see clearly now. Even with you, my dear, I should be lonely, and I could not bear children to be strange to me, aliens, born to something I did not understand." "It would not be strange to you. You would love your home," he murmured thickly. "You are truly dedicated to it. I am not. I should have to love it as you do, to be happy there as you are. Besides, you always belong to it. I see now. Your very face, your very speech show it. You have no idea how different you are, Don Pablo. And yet somehow I knew I could love you, because I did love Wharton Cameron so dearly." "Then why?" Again he begged her. "I am not a brave woman," she said steadily. "Not brave at all. I can go just so far, and then I see facts. I might even risk being a misfit, being unhappy myself, but not making you unhappy, and I should make you very unhappy if I were not happy. I should be happy forever if I had you with me, Dory." She shook her head. "No, dear, for you are not just Wharton Cameron. You are not even just Pablo Gutierrez. You are, as you said, Santa Eulalia. Let me ask you one straight question. Would you want me to marry you if I said I would be your wife gladly, but never willingly bear you a child?" "Dory! Dory!" His dark face grew somber with pain. "Why should I marry a man who wants a child more than he wants me?" "You don't understand, darling. I want you more than anything in the world. But I bound myself. I cannot destroy the race of the Gutierrez. I promised my uncle, my father, in very truth, a son for Santa Eulalia. A child is his right, and mine." He finished, broken but unflinching. "What I said is true. You are not Wharton. You are not even Pablo. You are Santa Eulalia. Love or no love, I cannot marry Santa Eulalia. Call me a coward if you must." He took her very gently in his arms. "I shall never call you anything but lovely. If I could give you courage, all would come well, I know. But if I can't, I can't. It is over. Goodbye, sweetheart." She hid her face on his shoulder. "Why did you do it?" "Remember, dear, that I never expected to see you again. If you loved me, back there, you gave me no sign." "I can't, Pablo." The words came muffled from her throat. "I could never be a Catholic. I could never be Mexican. I could never have a little Spanish son. and even if you could stay, I can see now that it wouldn't help. It would only tear my heart to pieces, and perhaps yours. Mine is torn already, Dory, and we must both forget, so it had better be over quickly. She lifted her head, but clung to him still. Kiss me again, once, Pablo, if you are willing. At last he released her. I can't see very clearly, Dory, he said. Show me the way out. I would rather not go into your house again. She led him to a gate in a far wall, and their hands clung once and parted. He saw only a pale golden blur as the gate swung to. My angel with the flaming sword, he whispered, and passed into a wooded road. End of section 9. Section 10 of Conquistador. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Conquistador by Katharine Fullerton Gerould. 8. The hacendado, contrary to expectation, returned in time to oversee the sending of the cattle southward. For some reason, forever unexplained to Francisco, he chose to accompany them a long distance upon their way. The hacienda saw Don Pablo for a day and a night, then had to wait for him again. He went to Mexico City before he returned to Santa Eulalia, so that it was 6 counted weeks before the final homecoming. But when he came, Don Miguel marked that his restlessness of the latter months had stilled. He was like a man so temperate of blood that he could not know fever. Don Pablo had not attended the Teatro Español, but he had lounged in cafes, had watched the señoritas, well guarded, coyly marching to church, had made acquaintance with such of their menfolk as had been Don Fernando's friends, had borne himself courteously at their clubs. He came back to the hacienda, well convinced that a Gutierrez was not like other Creole men. In only 2 places could a man conceivably feel close to reality, at Santa Eulalia itself, and, had facts been other, in a certain garden far to the north. Any counselor would have told him that he had essayed Mexico City too soon. Yet, for Pablo Gutierrez, it would not have been true. He was more ready to fall into the trap then than he would have been after another 12 months of the hacienda. It was Pablo's nature, as we have said, to be taught his own heart by a series of shocks. Between those passionate, spaced hours he merely lived, unanalytically, lethargic as to the spirit. He took to Mexico City an awakened mind that worked keenly on his own affairs. Alert, self-conscious, he made there certain renunciations. He saw himself once more as being thus and not otherwise. Don Miguel, whose profession it was to examine the human heart, and who, therefore, had become inevitably a curious soul, drew a sigh of relief after the second homecoming. These journeys, he was well aware, were significant, though just how he did not know. Being caballero himself, he did not press the matter. 2 months more of the quiet life of the hacienda went by before Don Pablo showed signs of willingness to speak. The healing balm of work and use and want had done much for Pablo. 3 months after he stepped out of Dory Main's garden, he buried Wharton Cameron forever, even giving Wharton Cameron's clothes to Vicente to burn, as useless now even for memory. He had not forgotten Dory, but she had refused his life. His life had to be lived. If he had thrown away love for a vow, in God's name, let him be about the business of his vow. An older man might have depended more heavily on time, but at 31 is still impatient. At all events, Pablo Gutierrez, living intensely at his appointed moments, and quietly repairing his mental tissues for long months between, had to be as his temperament made him. He sent one evening for Don Miguel, requesting that the priest join him in the room with the great desk and the barred windows. A decanter of Don Fernando's cognac and glasses stood on a table by his chair. The priest came in, his dark eyes blinking slightly at the lamps. "May I talk to you, Don Miguel, about certain things?" "Surely, my son. Do you wish to confess?" There had been no confession since the first return, and Don Miguel had wondered. "No, to talk to you, rather, as one man to another, the lifelong friend of my uncle, and a Creole like him. Of course, I do not forget that you are a priest." Pablo poured out the cognac and set the glass before the older man. "You will realize," he said then, "that since my uncle died, I have no one except you to whom I can talk. Vicente, yes, but with a difference. You are my spiritual superior, but you are also my only social equal here." "Yes, my son, as with Don Fernando, so with you." "I went to the United States a few months since, as you know, not telling my errand, even to you." Don Miguel did not take the trouble even to nod. "My errand was with a señorita I had known in my youth." "You are still very young, Don Pablo." The old face smiled at him. "No, not since I came to Santa Eulalia and became all Gutierrez, by law and in my heart. I asked the American señorita to marry me, as one does these things in the land where I was born." The priest nodded. He knew how the Americanos did things, but his heart beat hard. "She loved me, but she refused me. I thought your countrywomen always married for love." There was a naive wonder in the tone. "They consider that they do, but certain conditions of my life she could not face." "She must be very rich," sighed Don Miguel, "or very flighty." "She is not so rich as I," said Pablo calmly, "nor was she flighty enough to take that leap. At all events, she refused me. It is over." Don Miguel was not without sympathy, yet he could not but feel a stir of relief. "Well, Don Pablo?" he asked. "It does not matter why she would not marry me," Pablo went on, holding his cognac up to the lamplight and staring at it. "That was between her and me. But it means that there will never be a señora of the north for Santa Eulalia." "That is well, perhaps, Don Pablo." "It is perhaps well," the hacendado repeated, "but it means another thing, too. It means that there will never be a señora for Santa Eulalia. I shall not marry. In only this thing am I Americano. My notion of a wife, I told my uncle before he died. He understood. I cannot marry a señorita Spanish fashion, take a half-glimpsed bride from a notary's hand. It cannot be done by me. As Don Fernando knew before he died, I shall not marry," he repeated. "Yet I have no intention of neglecting my duty or breaking my word to my uncle. I promised him an heir for Santa Eulalia." "My son, you would not live in sin?" the priest asked. "Did you put that question to Don Fernando?" "I am not in the confessional now, Don Miguel. I am speaking to the only friend I have in the world, caballero to caballero. I have never taken any of the muchachas about the place. But if I take one, some day, could Don Miguel Serrano advise Don Pablo Gutierrez that it would be best to marry her? Santa Eulalia, my uncle said to me, is stronger than either of us. Santa Eulalia must be served. Santa Eulalia will never be served by lifting one of these many girls to the Senora's place." "Your senorita was not Spanish," murmured Don Miguel to himself. "No, but she was of stock as good as my father's, caballero in his own land. She had no Indian blood in her to make all the peons mutinous and drive the other half-breed girls to frenzy. My uncle saw that clear. For the sake of Santa Eulalia, do not marry her, Pablo, he said. Rather legitimize your son before you die. He would have preferred my marriage to a Spanish girl of his own class, but he knew it could not be. Yet he made me promise him a son. I promised him a son, Don Miguel, and since it is of the utmost importance that that son be educated for his destiny, and by me, I cannot longer put off begetting him. In other words, father, I will not take a wife for mere reasons of state, but a mistress I must. You shall give me whatever penance you gave my uncle, when I shall confess my sin to you. But now, tonight, I want only a friend's ear." There was no lack of respect in Pablo's tone, but he was firmness itself. "You have made up your mind, Don Pablo," the priest replied courteously. "And you are not in the confessional. We are sitting in your room over a glass of cognac. If it makes you happier to tell me these things, tell me, but do not ask advice of me about your intended sin." Pablo bent forward. "In your heart of hearts, Don Miguel, you know that, before God, I serve only Santa Eulalia and my uncle's wish. I keep an oath, and not for my own sake. I do not lust after any of them. Would to heaven I did. In your heart of hearts, you know that keeping my vow is penance enough. But for my uncle's sake, for Santa Eulalia's sake, for the sake of the order to which you were born, you will let me speak freely, and answer me freely as well." "For your own sake, Pablo," Don Miguel said gently. "I was not always a priest." But what he meant he did not say. Don Pablo Gutierrez rose and paced the floor. Sometimes his tall form was in bright lamplight, sometimes in shadow. The priest watched him intently, a tear winking, unseen, unfelt, in his eye. At last the young man stopped his resolute pacing and drifted to stillness beside the desk. "Before I went north, Don Miguel, Manuelita chattered to me of a convent in Chihuahua. I refused my sanction." Don Miguel shook his head. "Manuelita has no vocation, as I told her, only an aching heart. They are not always the same thing. I have hardly seen her since my return. She keeps faithfully to the dairy, Vicente tells me. It is in my mind," Pablo went on calmly, "to choose Manuelita, not that I would constrain any girl alive." Don Miguel stirred a little. "Every one in the hacienda, Pablo, knows how it is with Manuelita. It is common talk about the patio. She is very pretty, perhaps the prettiest, but I am sorry, for I think she is of finer mold than most. She has Quesada blood in her, far back, to be sure. Her mother was the daughter of old Don Jose." "You think her too good for me?" Pablo asked grimly. "We will leave irony out of this, Pablo," the older man returned quietly. "I meant only that if it is your firm intention to make some girl unhappy, I would rather it were not Manuelita. Indeed, I am not sure she is not the only one you could make unhappy. The others would take you lightly enough, and be sufficiently paid by your gifts and their pride of place. But when you are tired of Manuelita, it will hurt her more to be flung back or to see another succeed her. Still, a strain of the Quesada blood will do no harm to your son." "It is you who bring in irony, Don Miguel," answered Pablo. "I shall be kind to Manuelita, and I have no intention of keeping a seraglio. I see no reason why Manuelita should ever have a successor. The downward path is all too easy, hijo mío, groaned the old man. One sin leads to another. A man's prime lasts long. There are always pretty girls about. And who would marry a vaquero or a peon if the master would smile upon her? We will leave that. It is not worth discussing. I see why you will not marry her, the priest pursued. The Gutierrez have always put Santa Eulalia above religion. For themselves, for the peons, the two are cunningly interwoven. Therefore they are not gente de raison, and the hacienda prospers. But since you do not love her, could you not perhaps choose another, Clara or Inez? Pablo Gutierrez knelt down beside Don Miguel and bowed his forehead on the old man's arm. My father, he said brokenly, I am very sad. I want no woman in the world but one whom I cannot have. Not Manuelita, not Clara, not Inez. But I think Manuelita loves me, Pablo Gutierrez, not as these others. It is a bitter business, but since I cannot love, oh, Padre mio, let me be loved. Since I cannot have joy myself, let me give joy. So perhaps I shall find peace. A single sob shook his frame. The old man's hand touched his hair lightly. He sorrowed, truly, over Doña Mercedes's son. In a moment Pablo rose. His face was stern again, unmoved, as a caballero's should be. By all the things you have said, and all the things you did not say, I have learned what I wished, Don Miguel. My very great thanks. The priest rose. Do not neglect the sacraments too long, my son. I shall not, Father. Buenas noches. He conducted Don Miguel to the door and watched him step into the patio and towards his own place. Vicente, the old steward, who had been hovering in the great hall, heard the call and came. The patio was almost deserted, save for a few sleepy shadows of folk. I have not spoken with Manuelita since my return. Is she still industrious? Yes, senor. Pedro challenged us Sancho to fight tomorrow, simply because she appears in the patio to nurse Catalina, who is not well. Straight away the young men begin. Nonsense over a handkerchief, which doubtless she lost. This foolishness must stop. Send Pedro and Sancho to me in the morning, before they have time to fight. I will cool their hot heads for them. Find some other girl to nurse Catalina, and, since Manuelita is already in the house, tell her to come to me. Before God, senor, I do not believe Manuelita gave any handkerchief or dropped it with design, except when Catalina frets for her because no one else waits on her so well. The girl is always minding her business in the dairy. She never twinkles an eyelash at the worthless fellows. I am convinced that she does not deserve to be hidden or frightened. Don Pablo. There was appeal in the steward's voice. I will explain to her, all the same, that it must stop. Senor, Vicente stepped forward and spoke more firmly. Unless you and Don Miguel let Manuelita go to that convent she talks of, it will always be like this, until she loses her beauty. Why did you not let her marry Benito? Then all would have been well. Since then she will look at none of them. Before God, Don Pablo, it is not her fault. She has bewitched you too, I see, Vicente. All the same, I shall speak with her, tonight, if she has not gone to bed. Catalina must do with one of the others. Manuelita shall tell Pedro in the morning the truth about the handkerchief. None the less there will be bloodletting at sunrise, grumbled Vicente. There shall be no bloodletting. Send Manuelita to me here as soon as she can leave Catalina, and go, or send to Pedro, telling him that before he spills a drop of blood, Sancho's or another's, he is to face me. I will see him before my coffee in the morning. He turned his back on Vicente and strode into the great chamber, which had been Don Fernando's. It was unlighted, but he groped for the bed, and finding it in the darkness, knelt down by it, hiding his face in the musty counterpane. Before that sacred death-bed, in utter silence, he communed for a moment with the presence that had gone. Then he stepped again out of the shadows into the dim arcade, and so into his lamp-lit room. He poured himself a thimbleful of cognac and drank it, then lighted a cigarette and waited, standing, for Manuelita. Vicente ushered her in at last, and hovered in the background, obviously wishing to remain as witness for the defense. But Don Pablo sent him away with an uncompromising gesture, and bade him close the heavy door. Manuelita looked at her god in terror. Vicente had dropped a hint of what it was all about. "Señor, I gave no handkerchief," she gasped. "I was hurrying to Catalina, who was in pain and calling for me, and the stupid thing dropped." She looked at him piteously, but the god was smiling. At least he should not mock her. She held her head high, ready to defend her dignity. "I do not look at them, except at fiestas when we dance, and crown the prize winners with flowers. It is intolerable, Señor. Will you not let me go to Chihuahua?" Perhaps. For indeed he would constrain no woman. His smile disappeared. But Manuelita, outraged at being scolded anew for what was no fault of hers, trampled her fears underfoot. Then another thought struck her. "Señor, I have kept to the dairy except when Catalina calls for me. Then I must come, for she has been a mother to me since my own died." "Catalina will have to find another handmaid. Little Maria is clever with her fingers. Vicente tells me. She shall wait upon Catalina." The tears rose to her eyes. "Catalina will be sorry, and because I love her." But there was no appeal, if the master said it. "It will be hard," she murmured, "to be working far off in the dairy, thinking that Catalina needs me, but I must obey, unless—" She remembered that he had said, perhaps, "Unless you will indeed let me go to the Visitation Convent, Señor." She looked up hopefully. Don Pablo took a step nearer her and lighted another cigarette, watching her keenly all the while. "We are talking at cross purposes," he said coolly. "I shall speak to those crazy vaqueros in the morning, and send them about their business. I am sure you gave no handkerchief to Sancho, who has a cast in one eye. As for Catalina, she does not own you, and I do not choose to have you wear out your days putting poultices on an old woman's leg." He paused and contemplated his cigarette ash. "And as for Chihuahua and the convent, Manuelita, is it true, before God, that you would rather be a nun than anything else on earth? If so, you shall go." She colored deeply and put her fluttering hands up to her face as if the blood hurt her. "Then anything else I could ever be? Yes, Don Pablo." He pushed aside the empty cognac glasses and sat down on the edge of the table, swinging one leg and looking at her soberly. "I have been told that you love me, Manuelita. Is it true?" She turned away and hid her face. Not Don Miguel in the confessional could have got that from Manuelita in words. You need not be afraid to tell me if it is so. I could only be flattered. But she was silent under this last cruelty. The very sun was kinder to the flowers. She could only keep her back turned to him, and twist about in her trouble. He spoke again after a little. I begin to think it is not true, Manuelita, do you? His voice roughened. Do you love anyone else? No, Senor, before God, no, never. If a girl of your age, under our southern sun, has not yet learned to love, it may be that she never will. Perhaps the convent is the place for you, but you must answer me one question truthfully before I pack you off to the Mother Superior with a dowry. Would you rather be a nun or belong to me? The truth, Manuelita, only the truth. If you lied to me, I would kill you. In spite of his words, his voice was very gentle. She turned to face him, then through her tears, "The Senor knows," she answered brokenly, "that I love him far better than God. She looked down at the ground and whispered it. "I would rather belong to you, Don Pablo, than to be Santa Eulalia herself, singing in heaven." He laughed a little. "I was afraid of that vocation, child, but if you will only choose the better part, it shall be yours freely, for there is no question, Manuelita, that what I am proposing to you is sin in the eyes of the Church." "Yet, Don Fernando," she faltered. "Oh, there is no one will dare deny us. True, there may be heavy penances for you to do." "Penances?" She snapped her fingers at them. She looked up at him timidly. "But you do not love me, Don Pablo?" Pablo frowned a little. It was a stroke he must endure. "Any man could love a girl as pretty as you, Manuelita." "No, no," she wailed. "You have never been kind to me, Don Pablo. I think you hate me. I am afraid." He came to her then, and put his arms about her. He lifted her lightly, and, carrying her to a chair, seated himself and held her in a close heap. "Not so," he murmured. He straightened her limbs into comfort, and drew her head down to his shoulder, resting his cheek upon hers. "Not so, child. I have nothing in my heart but a great tenderness for you. You need not be afraid. I would not hurt you for the world. We shall comfort each other, Carita mia, for I, too, need comforting." These were high matters beyond her, that Don Pablo should need comforting. But her lord had stooped to hold her in his arms, and she was no longer afraid. As for him, he had found a woman who placed him above God or loneliness. The comfort of that knowledge stole through every cranny of his mind, and, in truth, he needed an anodyne, remembering Dory Maine's blonde head and his rejected dreams. He had destroyed bitterness, yet he was inevitably soothed, uplifted, by the sense that he was bringing to this girl beside him not only joy, but pride past telling. Her meekness and her passion stirred him to gratitude. Ah, she should be happy. That would be his duty and his reward. Pablo Gutierrez had made 2 vows, and by grace of this meek and passionate creature he would keep them both. He kissed her forehead gently, and a great peace descended upon him. "Santa Eulalia," he whispered, as if a vision held him. "Santa Eulalia." Manuelita, numb with her miracle, stirred faintly against him. "You spoke to me?" "No, child, to God, and to the noble deed." She shivered at that, and he soothed her, leaning his cheek against her dark hair. End of section 10. End of Conquistador by Katharine Fullerton Gerould.